Hey there. I know why you're here. You're looking for a story that will help you drift off into a peaceful sleep. Something calming, a little mysterious. Something that carries your mind away. Well, you've come to the right place. Before we begin tonight's journey, do me a little favor. Tap the like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. Even just a good night. It really helps more sleepy souls like you find their way here. Now, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let's begin tonight's story. It began with a sound, too soft to stir alarm at first. Just a knock, barely audible, like distant wood tapping against drywall. It came once a night, always at the same time, 3:09 a.m., not 3:08, not 3:10. There was a precision to it that made it feel unnatural, like the timing mattered more than the noise itself. At first it was chalked up to house settling or temperature shifts, maybe even a faulty pipe, but when it repeated for the sixth night in a row, exactly on time, the mind could no longer explain it away. There were no footsteps, no shadow at the door, no wind outside, only the sound, 3 slow knocks, a pause, then silence so deep it seemed to listen back. It wasn't loud enough to wake someone from sleep, but it was loud enough to stay in the memory once heard and once noticed. It became impossible to ignore. On the 7th night, curiosity overrode caution. The hallway camera, barely used except for motion triggers, was manually set to record overnight. No alarms went off, no movement detected, but at 3:09 a.m. it picked up the sound. 3 distinct knocks, mechanical almost, too evenly spaced, too exact in pitch. When the footage was played back the next morning, the video showed nothing. No shadows, no movement, no flicker of light, just an empty hallway and the knocking. But what unsettled more than the knock itself was what came after it. A low warbling hum followed, like static trying to form words, and then a breath, shallow, inhale, exhale. But no one was there. The sound was extracted from the footage and copied to a laptop. No editing, no enhancements, just raw audio played on loop. It wasn't until the 3rd loop that something felt wrong, not just eerie, wrong in the bones, like the rhythm didn't make sense. It wasn't building up to a crescendo, it was winding down, as if the knock had already happened and was being unraveled. A hunch struck. What if the sound wasn't meant to be heard forward? On a whim, the file was dragged into a free audio program and reversed. The knocking, when played backward, was no longer a knock. It was speech, not in any language the listener could recognize, but undeniably a pattern, a chant, slow, almost melodic, spoken in a voice so low it felt more like vibration than sound, and it repeated 5 times before vanishing beneath the breathy static. The chant dug into the mind like a splinter, refusing to be ignored. It was heard over and over again, louder with each loop, not in volume but in presence, like it wasn't coming from the speakers anymore, but from somewhere closer, somewhere internal. Headphones didn't help. Earplugs didn't matter. The chant echoed in the brain like a song stuck in memory, but far more sinister. It didn't feel like a message. It felt like a request. Not from someone trying to reach out, but from something waiting to be let in. Something older than language, older than voice. Every time it looped, the air felt heavier. The temperature dropped slightly, though no window was open. And always, always, the breath at the end, as though the chant wasn't just being spoken. It was being heard by something. 2 days passed without sleep. The audio was deleted, and re-downloaded multiple times, as if the act of resetting it could erase the unease. It couldn't, and deleting the file didn't help either. The knocking still came at 3:09, but now it was followed by something new. The breath was no longer part of the playback. It was in the room, audible without speakers, close, like someone standing behind the curtain of the night. Lights were kept on now, every door locked, every window checked. But fear has a way of slipping through cracks. Logic can't seal, because what if the sound wasn't from something outside? What if it was something buried inside the house, inside the walls, inside the self? Eventually, a search was made, not through the attic or basement, but online, forums, paranormal boards, obscure threads buried beneath years of digital dust. After hours of sifting through hoaxes and ghost stories, a single comment stood out, just a phrase, left anonymously. Some knocks aren't meant to be answered, some are meant to be repeated, until something listens back. Beneath it, a second comment, if it speaks in reverse, it walks in reverse. That was it. No explanation, no context, but it was enough to freeze the blood, because suddenly the idea clicked. This wasn't a haunting in the traditional sense. It was a ritual, a recording not left behind, but performed, and whoever had performed it last had vanished. By the 9th night, nothing could drown it out. Not headphones, not music, not prayer. The knocking returned at 3:09. 3 taps, 1 pause, then breath. Except this time, the breath wasn't shallow. It was deliberate, like someone testing their lungs for the first time. The hallway camera was unplugged. The laptop powered off, but the sound still came, as though the very walls had become an instrument, a speaker for something else. That night, he didn't sleep, not out of fear, but because when the knocking stopped, something whispered in a language he couldn't understand, not in his ears, but in his head. The recording wouldn't leave his thoughts. Even after wiping the laptop's drive and destroying the external recorder, the rhythm remained etched in his mind. He could still hear it, always faintly in the background of his day. The chant looped silently like an earworm carved from memory rather than sound. It had become more than something he heard. It had become something he remembered, and it refused to fade. That was when he reached out, not to friends, not to family, but to someone with experience in things not easily explained, a man of faith, the kind who wore silence like a second skin and carried dread behind tired eyes. When the reversed recording was described, the priest didn't laugh or doubt. He just asked to hear it. The chant was recreated from memory, phonetic syllables spoken into the priest's old tape deck. When played backward, the sound morphed into the same chilling cadence as the original file. The priest stiffened the moment it played, like something ancient had touched him. He stopped the tape midway through the 3rd repetition. There was a long pause before he spoke. He said it was Latin, not textbook Latin, but old, liturgical, possibly pre-Roman. He spoke the translation in a whisper. Ad me veni, per mortem, surges. The words hung in the air like ash. Come to me, through death, rise. A summoning chant, he called it. Not a prayer, not a curse. A door, a call to the dead. Not to remember them, but to invite them back. The priest said he had only heard of this phrase once before, in a manuscript buried deep in Vatican archives. Never published, never digitized. It was part of a collection labeled simply Periculi Orations, Dangerous Prayers. He explained that the chant was never intended to be read aloud. It was encoded in backwards rhythm to keep it sealed. To read it forward was to unlock it. To play it in reverse was to perform it. He asked how many times it had been played. When he heard on loop 5 times, his eyes darkened. "Then something has heard it," he said. "And if it has heard you, it may begin looking." He stood then and backed away from the tape deck like it had grown teeth. The priest refused to take the recording with him. He offered only one piece of advice: never play it again, not even in thought. Don't hum it, don't recall the rhythm. Starve it of memory, starve it of attention. He said that some things live off invitation, and that thinking is a form of calling. If it was played backward, he warned, it heard it forward. Then he paused, like there was more. He didn't want to say. After a long silence, he added something that didn't make sense at first. It comes in reverse. It walks backward through time. What you thought was the beginning might be the end. That night, every light in the house was turned on. Every room checked, then checked again. And still at exactly 3:09 a.m., the knocking returned. But this time, it wasn't confined to one spot. It moved. Knock far left wall. Knock beside the bedroom closet. Knock below the floorboards. The sound was exploring, mapping the layout like a blind thing feeling its way through unfamiliar space. And when it finally stopped, the breath came again. But not from the air this time, from the walls themselves, as though the house was breathing in with him, holding it, listening. Over the next few days, the mirror in the hallway began to change. It wasn't the reflection that remained accurate at first, but the glass itself seemed too clean, too still, the kind of stillness that's unnatural. When passed by, the mirror gave off a strange chill, even when the rest of the hallway was warm. Once, while walking past, the faint sound of the reversed chant seemed to echo faintly, just one syllable, like the tail end of a whisper. The mirror began to fog slightly around the edges, despite the dry air. He wiped it clean, but within minutes, the fog returned. There were no answers, only signs. Things shifting in ways that could still be dismissed by a rational mind, but barely. The priest stopped answering his calls, and at night, the knocking grew bolder, not louder, just closer. It no longer seemed interested in hiding. It wanted to be noticed, and the more it was noticed, the more it seemed to grow. The rhythm had changed now too. 3 knocks, a pause, then 4. Like an added beat in a ritual. Each knock felt intentional, like a pattern forming. One night, the knock stopped altogether, but the breath remained. And that was worse, because when the sound vanished, the silence felt not like absence, but anticipation. The hallway mirror had always been just that, a decoration. A neutral rectangle of glass hung opposite the old wooden door, but now it felt alive. Not visibly, not with motion or sound, but with something quieter, intent. When standing in front of it, the reflection came a half-second too slow, just enough to make the skin crawl. At first, it was subtle enough to question, was it just tired eyes, or delayed perception? But then the delay grew, a blink that didn't match, a movement that lagged, and worst of all, a smile that stayed a fraction too long after the real one had faded. It wasn't dramatic or cinematic. It was quiet, off. Like the reflection was no longer reflecting, but observing, and perhaps remembering a different timeline. Then came the breath marks. At first he thought they were smudges, condensation patches that appeared in perfect arcs near shoulder height. But they formed even when he hadn't been near the mirror. Late at night, after the knocking, they'd appear, fogged ovals. Sometimes just one, sometimes two, side by side, as if something was standing there, breathing, watching. On one occasion, the fog took longer to clear than usual, and as it faded, it revealed a faint smudge in the center, a shape like a handprint. Not a full palm, but fingertips, pressed hard against the glass, as if something inside had tried to reach out, and the tips had been facing outward. He stopped cleaning the mirror after that. Every wipe felt like a disturbance, like erasing a message meant to be seen. The house grew colder. The knocks no longer obeyed time. They came early, late, sometimes twice a night. One evening, they arrived just after sunset. 3 knocks. A pause, then 4, then silence. He didn't answer. He never answered. But each time he ignored it, something changed. The mirror fogged faster. The delay in the reflection grew worse. One night, while staring into it, he blinked, and his reflection didn't. For a full second, it just stood there, eyes open. Then very slowly, it blinked back. Not mimicking, responding. There were dreams now, dreams that didn't feel like dreams. Walking through the house, only to find the doors reversed. The hallway stretched in the wrong direction, the light switches on the opposite side. In these dreams, the mirror didn't reflect him. It reflected someone else, someone moving opposite his every action, but with slight hesitations. Sometimes the mirror version seemed to open its mouth, as if to speak, but no sound came. Just a humming, low, droning, and filled with rhythm. One night, he woke with the sound of the reversed chant ringing in his ears, and for the first time, the voice was his own. He tried to cover the mirror, taped a blanket over it, but every morning, the blanket would be on the floor. The tape peeled back, as if by careful fingers. One night, he nailed plywood over it. The knocking didn't come that night. Instead, the entire house groaned. Floorboards, windows, even the pipes trembled, as if something was pacing, angry. When he approached the mirror the next morning, the plywood was intact, but cold to the touch, freezing, and beneath it, faintly, the sound of a breath. Not a ghostly moan, not a dramatic hiss, just breath, calm, measured, waiting. On the 12th night, he found his reflection wasn't alone. It happened without warning. He passed by the hallway quickly, just a glance, but the mirror showed a figure standing behind him, not moving, not distinct, just present, a silhouette in the background. By the time he turned around, the hallway was empty, but the reflection still held the shape, frozen, watching. That was the first time he truly considered leaving the house. But when he opened the front door, the wind that rushed in smelled wrong, like turned earth, like something freshly unearthed. He closed the door and locked it twice. The next night, he watched the mirror from the staircase, refusing to approach. For an hour, nothing happened, but at exactly 3:09, he saw it fog, slowly, softly. Then a single knock echoed, not from the hallway, but from within the mirror. His reflection didn't move, but the glass did, a ripple, like breath on water. And then, in the corner of the mirror, not visible in real space, something stepped forward. A leg, then a shoulder, then nothing. It stopped, but the fog remained, as did the pressure in the air. It no longer felt like something was coming. It felt like it had arrived. By the 13th night, silence had become the most terrifying sound of all. It stretched through the rooms like a presence, thick, oppressive, alive. Even the floorboards refused to creak. No wind brushed against the windows. No hum came from the refrigerator. It was as if the entire house had gone still in anticipation. The knocks no longer came from the hallway alone. They sounded from the ceiling, from beneath the stairs, from the inside of closed closets. Always the same pattern. 3 knocks, pause, 4 knocks. But now the timing had warped. It came multiple times a night. Sometimes hours apart, sometimes minutes. Once it knocked 3 times in a row without pause, then stopped, as if deciding something. He had stopped sleeping altogether. Sleep invited dreams, and dreams gave the mirror too much space. It whispered to him in sleep. It didn't speak with words, but with pressure, with impressions. It showed him places he hadn't been. Cold corridors, black water, old wood and bone, and faces, always faces, backward facing, eyes open wide, mouths moving in reverse. He'd wake up with nosebleeds, with his ears ringing. One night he found a line of soot on the wall just above his bed. A perfect horizontal smear, like the track of a finger. He didn't touch it. The smell of burnt incense hovered around it, even though he never burned any. He tried to speak to the priest again. Left voicemails, sent emails, even drove to the chapel. The building was locked. A note was nailed to the heavy wooden door, scribbled in a trembling hand. All it said was, "Do not unseal the silence. It remembers who speaks." There was no signature, no sign of the priest. The chapel looked abandoned, as if it had been closed for years. When he checked records online, it was listed as inactive since 1996. But he'd been there, he'd spoken to someone, and the tape deck was still in the pew, covered in dust now, with the reverse chant still loaded, though the cassette was warped. Returning home, the air inside felt different, thicker. He stepped through the doorway, and the door closed behind him, seemingly without wind. The lights flickered, just once. Then silence, but not empty silence. Something pressed against it, like sound waiting to break through. He turned slowly, and saw the mirror had uncovered itself again. The plywood remained nailed, but the reflection now shimmered behind the wood, like light bending in water, as if the glass wasn't gone, just hidden. And now something behind it pulsed, matching his breath. Then, anticipating it, he decided he had to end it, not escape, not run, but finish whatever had begun. He returned to the audio editor, dug up backups from cloud storage. He didn't even remember syncing. The chant file was still there, undeletable now. Every attempt to remove it resulted in failure messages, files locked, permissions denied, so he played it again. Once, in full, no loops, no reverse, just forward. The voice on the file had changed. It was still low, still rhythmic, but now it sounded like his voice, slowed, layered, like it had always been him. At the end of the chant, there was no breath, just a single knock, louder than anything he'd heard before. It didn't come from the speakers. It came from inside the house. The lights dimmed, but didn't go out. The hallway grew colder by degrees. The mirror's plywood began to rattle, not violently, not theatrically, but persistently, as if whatever was behind it was no longer trying to break through, but simply pushing against time, rewinding it. And then, without warning, the knocking stopped. Everything stopped. No wind, no hum, no breath. Even the sound of his own heartbeat seemed to fade. In its place came a whisper, not in Latin, not in English, just a sound. Familiar, internal, like the echo of something he had once forgotten. It spoke inside his head. "I see you." He fell to the floor, not from fear but from weight. The pressure of presence filled the house. pressing down on every beam and nail. The walls ached. The glass in picture frames cracked. And through it all, the mirror began to glow, not with light, but with clarity. The plywood remained nailed shut, but the mirror showed through it anyway, as if physical barriers no longer mattered. His reflection was gone. In its place stood a figure in reverse, a silhouette shaped like him, but wrong, too tall, too still, its head tilted slightly, as if in amusement or hunger. Then the final knock came, louder than all the rest, singular, final, not from the mirror, not from the walls, from inside his mind, and everything went dark. When he woke, it wasn't to sound, but to its complete absence. The house wasn't quiet. It was silent in a way that felt artificial, constructed, like someone had pressed mute on reality. No creaks, no distant cars, no breath. The air itself didn't move. His limbs felt heavier, like they'd been disconnected and sewn back together with unfamiliar thread. Time didn't make sense. His phone screen displayed 3:09 a.m., but daylight poured through the cracks in the blinds. The clock on the wall blinked the same time. Frozen, he touched it. Nothing changed. It felt like time itself had folded, and he'd been caught in the crease. The hallway looked stretched, thinner than it had before. He rose slowly, his body unfamiliar, like it belonged to something else, and he was only borrowing it for the moment. The house looked the same, but the stillness was unnatural. Nothing felt alive, not even him. His memory was fragmented. There were no dreams he could recall, only impressions. He remembered being surrounded by glass, an ocean of mirrors, all fogged except one. Inside that single unfogged reflection, he wasn't standing. He was sitting, still, blank-faced, watching something beyond the glass. The mirrors pulsed slightly, as if they breathed, and behind them moved figures, tall, shrouded in backwards time. Every movement seemed wrong, not mirrored, but reversed. Arms swinging backward, heads turning before bodies, a rhythm of the unnatural. One mirror cracked when he blinked, another shattered when he opened his mouth. But he had made no sound. At the center of them all, a shape too tall for the room stood motionless. He couldn't remember what it looked like, only that when it faced him, every mirror darkened, and then the knocking returned. But this time, it didn't come from outside him. It came from inside his own chest. 3 beats. Pause. 4 more. He sat for what felt like hours, staring at the plywood-covered mirror in the hallway. The air around it shimmered faintly, like heat waves, but the house was cold. He hadn't touched the mirror since the figure had appeared behind his reflection, yet it still changed on its own. He no longer trusted the laws of time, of space, of cause and effect. He remembered things he hadn't lived, dreamed of places he'd never seen, but now missed, as if leaving them had left part of him behind. The chant played again in his head, but now the words were familiar. He hadn't learned them, he had always known them. That truth wrapped around his thoughts, like ivy. The plywood covering the mirror pulsed, faint, like breath behind a wall. It wasn't just a barrier, it was a lid. Something was beneath it, not trapped, not imprisoned, waiting, inhaling. The silence in the house wasn't the absence of sound, it was the presence of breath being held. He walked outside for the first time in days, needing air that didn't feel touched. The sun was too bright, the colors too sharp. People moved wrong, too fast, or too slow. A child's laugh skipped, like a record. A bird landed on a wire, and never blinked. When he looked again, it was gone without moving. He tried to drive, but the car wouldn't start. The key turned, the lights blinked, but the engine didn't respond. He walked 3 blocks and realized he hadn't passed a single person twice, but also hadn't seen anyone new. The world outside felt looped, programmed, not haunted, but rewritten. On a whim, he returned to the place where the chapel had once been. There was no building now, just gravel. An empty lot. The priest's warning echoed louder than any siren. Do not unseal the silence. It remembers who speaks. He hadn't spoken aloud in hours, maybe days. The thought of hearing his own voice now terrified him. He searched again for anyone who had written about this, anything resembling what he had seen, felt, or heard. It wasn't about hope anymore. It was about confirmation, validation that he wasn't alone, that what was happening had happened before. A deep web thread, archived and untouched since 2012, surfaced with a title that stopped his heart. If you hear it in reverse, don't answer the mirror. The thread was short, only 6 entries, but each described the same chant, the same knocking, the same mirror. One user described time bending inward. Another claimed they saw themselves in mirrors doing things they hadn't done. The final entry was only 2 words. It's listening. No username, no timestamp, just that. He read the thread over and over until the words felt tattooed behind his eyes. When he stood, the plywood over the mirror was cracked, a thin split from corner to corner. He hadn't touched it. That night, at 3:09, the knocking returned, but not from the mirror. It came from inside the closet in his bedroom. 3 sharp knocks, then silence, then 4 more. He stood frozen. The doorknob didn't move, but the space around it felt wrong, expanded, like the inside was larger than the outside. He didn't open it. He didn't speak. He sat in the hallway, watching the mirror through the split in the plywood. Behind the crack, something shimmered, not like light, but like movement seen through water. The air grew denser, not colder, heavier, like presence had weight. He tried to blink, but his reflection didn't move. It was looking past him, into the hallway. Slowly, it raised a finger to its lips. A gesture for silence. And behind its shoulder, a second figure stepped into view. Not a duplicate. Not a shadow. A different being. Taller. Blurred at the edges. It raised a hand, knocked once, and smiled. The next morning, the closet door was open. Inside, nothing had been disturbed, but something had been added. A small scrap of mirror lay on the floor, barely the size of a coin. Its edge shimmered like the crack in the hallway glass. When he looked into it, he didn't see his own face. He saw the figure, not in full, just a partial image. A shoulder, part of a mouth, a single backwards eye. It blinked. Then the glass split silently, crumbling into dust. He swept it up and buried the pieces outside in the garden, though the ground resisted the shovel, like the earth didn't want to take it. That night, the house remained silent. The mirror didn't shimmer. No knocks came, but that silence didn't feel like peace. It felt like something had moved on and left a part of itself behind. Something that didn't need to knock anymore, because now it had found a voice. He stopped sleeping, not because he was afraid of dreams, but because the dreams stopped asking permission. Even when he tried to stay awake, time slipped beneath him. His eyes would close for seconds, and when they opened again, hours were gone. The house changed during those absences. Curtains he'd never owned now framed the windows. A coat he'd never worn hung by the door. The hallway had one more step than it did yesterday, but the mirror remained the same, plywood covered, cracked down the center like a wound that never healed. The crack began to pulse faintly at night, like a heartbeat slowed. The knocking no longer came from doors or walls. It came from his bones, a rhythm behind his ribs, a sound only he could hear. It grew louder when he ignored it, sharper when he acknowledged it. Every tick of the clock felt like a countdown, but there was no event, no climax, only presence, and that presence no longer needed to introduce itself. He visited the graveyard, not out of mourning, but instinct. Something about it felt like the right place to be, though he had no loved ones buried there. As he wandered between headstones, the names blurred in his vision, letters rearranging. He saw his own last name on 4 different stones, though none were related to him. He touched one, and a rush of memories not his own poured into his head. Visions of dark rooms, faces covered in soot, chanting voices counting backward in Latin. He pulled his hand back, and the memories stopped. But something had followed, a pressure behind his eyes. That night, as he stared at the mirror, his reflection wept without him. Tears slid down the cheeks of the man behind the glass, though his own face remained dry, and the reflection mouthed a single word he didn't understand. Yet, that was the first night he understood what the priest had meant by, "It's not just a spirit, it's a call." The phrase repeated itself now, not just in the chant, but in his thoughts, threaded through his every sentence. He would try to say something mundane, and it would twist on his tongue. Instead of, "I'm tired," he would mutter ego voco te, the Latin phrase meaning "I call you." It happened unconsciously, until the words lost their mystery and became part of his breath. That's when he stopped speaking to people, not because he wanted isolation, but because it felt dangerous to talk aloud. He could feel the phrase hitching in his throat, always waiting to escape, as if it wanted to be said in front of someone else. The few friends who tried to check on him left disturbed. One said his eyes didn't follow movement right. Another claimed his shadow lingered behind him after he left a room. The last one never came inside, just stood at the door and stared through the crack. When asked what was wrong, she simply whispered, "You're not alone in there," and walked away. He dug deeper into the Latin chant, obsessively, not just translation, but origin. There was no formal record of it in classical texts, no matching phrase in any documented ritual, but fragments showed up in footnotes of obscure religious manuscripts. One from a forgotten monastery in 1792. Another carved into the margins of a prayer book buried in ash after a chapel fire in 1921. The words never changed, per aperturum silent, voco te. Through the breach of silence, I call you. The chant wasn't a curse or a warning. It was a beacon, a ritualistic flare meant not to drive spirits away, but to guide them, to draw them towards something open. The terrifying realization hit him slowly. He hadn't been cursed by the chant. He had completed it. Simply hearing it in reverse had closed the loop. The mirror was no longer a barrier. It was a bridge, and he had already walked halfway across without realizing. That night, something answered the chant more directly. He didn't hear it. He felt it. A voice that didn't use sound, but memory. It arrived as sensation, like remembering a cold wind or a scream you never heard. It asked no questions. It simply stated, "We heard you." Then came the sound, not knocking, but scratching, not at the walls, at the inside of his skull, as if something was testing the surface of his mind for weak spots. He screamed without sound, mouth open, but lungs frozen. And when he looked into the hallway mirror's crack, a third face now joined his reflection, not behind him, beside him, same height, no features, just shape. And the longer he stared, the more it resembled him, not quite identical, but made of him. A version assembled from scraps of memory and breath. A figure born of the phrase he'd unknowingly whispered again and again, not summoned. Reflected, for the first time since it began, he begged for it to stop, on his knees in the hallway, whispering to the crack in the mirror. He pleaded. He said he didn't want it, that he didn't understand, that he took it back. But the mirror didn't crack further, it healed. The split sealed slowly, from top to bottom. The wood walked slightly, as if the surface behind it had shifted. He was left staring at a solid board again. No shimmer, no pulse, no voice. The silence returned, but it wasn't peaceful. It was like being exiled, cut off from something he had already let in. And in that exile came clarity. It hadn't come to haunt him. It had come to use him, to speak through him. The knocking was its arrival, the chant, its tether. And now that he'd tried to sever the bond, it would wait, but it would never leave. Then came the mirrors, all of them, even those he had covered. At exactly 3:09 a.m., every reflective surface in the house began to bleed, slow, black droplets sliding down glass like sweat. No temperature, just movement. He smashed them, one by one. But each time he turned, another had appeared. Not actual mirrors, reflections. Reflections on phones, on blank TV screens, in dark windows, each showing him something, not from this world. Staircases that descended into water, corridors, too long for physics, eyes watching from ceilings. It wasn't about escape anymore, it was about containment. He boarded windows, shut off devices, lived in the dark, and still, reflections found him. He knew what they were now, not portals, not visions, but mouths, and they were whispering. The reflections no longer waited to be seen. They anticipated him. Wherever he turned, his image blinked before he did. It smiled faintly when he didn't. Once he passed a blank computer screen, and the screen lit up, not with code, not with light, but with his reflection mouthing the chant, backward. His hands shook as he unplugged everything in the room, but even the unplugged glass of the dark screen shimmered like a pond. He had stopped speaking aloud entirely. Even a whispered word triggered echoes now, soft whispers that didn't match what he said, repeating things he hadn't thought. The walls no longer creaked like wood. They breathed, sometimes in, sometimes out, and the door frame seemed to lean just slightly toward him as he walked by, like the house was listening to his footsteps, memorizing the rhythm. He covered his mouth when he breathed, hoping to muffle whatever thing inside him had been using breath as a language. But the silence didn't help. In fact, it made the whispers clearer. He tried to leave, packed a bag, walked out without looking back, made it halfway down the street before everything fell wrong. The world felt artificial, too bright, too quiet, too still. People's faces were smeared in his peripheral vision, like something hadn't rendered properly. Trees looked like paper. A dog barked, but had no mouth. And then he saw it, his house, still ahead of him. He had never left. He was still standing in front of the door, key in hand, bag still at his feet. Time had looped without his permission. He staggered backward in terror, heart slamming against ribs. His skin felt wrong. The sun was in the wrong position. And the worst part was, he didn't remember unlocking the door. But now, it stood open. Just a few inches, enough to invite, enough to say, "Come in." But the house didn't need him to walk in anymore. It had already moved into him. After that, time dissolved. Clocks worked, but no longer meant anything. He would blink and find himself in different parts of the house, sometimes holding things, sometimes muttering. The Latin phrase returned, but now layered in different voices, not just his. He began recording without knowing why, leaving audio files on his phone with names he didn't remember typing. One simply read, "Listen to me." He played it. It started as static, then slow breathing, then a voice, not his, repeating the chant again and again. Forward, the original version, clear, commanding. And beneath it, a second voice whispered the translation. Through the breach of silence, "I call you." That's when it occurred to him. What he had heard in reverse was only the reply. The real chant had been sent out long before. He was never the first to speak. He was just the one who answered. He reached out again to the priest, desperate. This time, the priest didn't meet him in a chapel or over the phone. Instead, a letter arrived. No stamp, no return address. Just one line in shaky handwriting. "The voice you heard is older than the words." Beneath it, a prayer scrawled in Latin. But this time it wasn't a chant. It was a barrier, a linguistic blockade, meant to jam the ritual, confuse the pattern. He read it aloud, trembling, over and over, for hours, maybe longer, and for a moment, everything stopped. The walls ceased breathing, the mirrors stilled, the whispers froze mid-syllable. It felt like a divine silence. But then, deep in the bowels of the house, beneath the foundation, a different knock came. Not slow, not curious, angry, as if something had been paused and didn't like it. The silence snapped like a rope under tension. He ran, not to escape, but to confront it. If it had a voice, it had a form, and maybe it could be seen. He descended into the basement, though it had never been opened before. The lock was gone, the stairs wet. He stepped into the dark with only the prayer in his mind, whispering it like a shield. The further down he went, the more the air lost its weight, like walking underwater without resistance. At the bottom, there was no room, just space, endless black, and something moving within it, not fast, not slow, just aware. The knocking echoed again, but from inside his head this time. The sound didn't ask to be heard. It demanded to be understood. And then came the phrase again, only this time, it was not spoken in Latin, it was spoken in memory. The memory of his childhood voice, his teenage cry, his adult scream. It used his own sounds against him, shaping them into a command. Finish the chant. He fell to his knees, not in prayer, in surrender. And in that moment, the thing that knocked finally stepped forward and entered completely. When he awoke, he was upstairs again. Morning, light, but nothing felt warm. His bones felt hollow, like a house that had been emptied. Every sound in the house was now reversed. Clocks ticked backward, faucets undripped, even birdsong came in rewind. He turned on the TV and saw himself speaking, but the words were all backward. He read lips now, not because he wanted to, but because he understood them. He understood all of it. The language of backward chants, the breath phrases, the mirror echoes. He had become a part of it. The ritual wasn't an event, it was a transformation, one that didn't end in possession. It ended in replacement, and slowly, the world outside began to forget him. His phone had no contacts. His photos were blank. His name vanished from records. And when he called the priest's number, The line didn't ring. It just said, "No such number exists." But he knew that wasn't true. The priest hadn't vanished. The priest had simply been called. Now he walks the house like a keeper, not a victim. The mirrors no longer frighten him. They answer him. The chant no longer repeats. It obeys. He doesn't eat, doesn't sleep, just waits, because he knows now that the knocking will return. And when it does, someone else will hear it. Someone curious, someone tired, someone who records it and plays it backward. And when they do, he will be there, not to stop them, but to finish it with them. The breach isn't in the mirror anymore. It's in language, in breath, in the quiet between sentences. All it needs is a voice to carry it forward, and he is no longer afraid of speaking. He is waiting to be heard. He no longer counted days. The calendar refused to update. His phone showed no signal, no date, just a blank lock screen that sometimes displayed a phrase in Latin when he glanced too long. The house felt bigger now, rooms stretching farther than before, as if the architecture had been rewritten. Hallways branched where none had existed. A staircase emerged in the pantry. He stopped trying to map it. Some nights, he wandered and didn't return to his bedroom for hours. The walls pulsed faintly with sound, like the memory of knocking, not actual knocks. The phrase lingered under his breath constantly, unspoken but loud in his chest. It had become the rhythm of his heartbeat. One knock, two reversed syllables, three breaths. The structure of the chant embedded itself in his biology. He didn't fight it. There was nothing to fight. The mirrors now showed reflections that moved before he did, leading his gestures, not following them. When he waved, the figure finished the motion first. He once stared for an hour, watching his mirrored self mouth Latin phrases with his own lips tightly shut. He could understand the words without needing to speak them. The chant no longer needed voice. It lived in intention. Thought had become the ritual. Somewhere deep inside he felt a tether loosening, his identity fraying like rope left too long in rain. And then, during a sleepless stretch of night, the knocking returned again. Only this time, it came from outside the house. Not the door, the sky, above the roof. Each impact echoed in reverse, like thunder crashing before the lightning. The sound made him rise and walk outside barefoot, as though answering a call. The stars above pulsed like static. One by one they blinked out, not darkness swallowing them, but something pulling them inward, as though the sky itself were being drawn into a black funnel. In the silence between those starless seconds, he heard the chant spoken, not in breath, but in atmosphere. The wind chanted, the soil hummed. His bones vibrated with every reversed syllable, and then he saw something move, not in the distance, but above his reflection. His shadow rippled on the pavement. He looked up and saw no clouds, just something hanging there, silent, formless but aware. The knocking, he realized, was not meant to alert him. It was meant to summon that thing. And now the invitation was complete. He had delivered the chant fully, through dreams, through recordings, through thought, and whatever waited on the other end had found its way here. He spoke to no one after that. When he turned on the radio, it played static with whispered responses to his thoughts. Television screens displayed his house, live footage, but from angles that didn't exist, corners of the house he had never seen, or perhaps never dared to look into. One screen showed him sleeping, though he was wide awake. Another showed him watching from the window, though he was at the kitchen table. Time was folding, or more accurately, time was being rewritten. The chant, once only a phrase, had become a map. an ancient sequence of syllables that altered the space it filled. The priest's prayer, meant to block it, had merely delayed its full arrival. He had not stopped the ritual. He had just given it more time to grow stronger. The neighbors no longer saw him. They waved, but never at him. His mailbox no longer filled. Packages stopped coming. Once he screamed from the front porch as people walked by, but they didn't hear him. The chant had rewritten his presence in the world. Not erased, not dead, just misplaced, dislocated from reality's center, tethered only to the ritual's thread. He began hearing new phrases, ones he hadn't spoken or recorded. They slipped into his dreams. The chant is the gate. The breath is the ink. The dead don't knock. They listen. And then came the final phrase, clearer than the rest. The last step is not to speak it. It's to pass it on. That's when he realized he was no longer the audience. He was the next mouth. One morning, a child's voice echoed in the distance. Not outside, but through the vent. It repeated a syllable he recognized, the first reversed knock he had heard months ago. He sat up, cold sweat trailing down his back. He turned on the audio recorder and whispered into it, "Don't listen to this. Dead." He hit play in reverse and heard the child, responding, laughing, repeating the chant playfully, like a song. He fell to his knees and wept. The chant had found a new voice, not because he sent it, but because it had always intended to travel. He was never the destination. He was the channel, a vessel, and once it had learned how to move through breath, thought, reflection, it didn't need him anymore. It had become airborne, viral, conceptual, an idea wrapped in ancient words, wearing the skin of a knock. Now he waits, but not for answers, for echoes. Every once in a while, the mirror flickers and shows a stranger's room, a child's toy on the floor, a mother humming, a screen glowing in the corner. And in those brief moments, he knows the chant is already there, beneath the floorboards, in the humming, in the pauses between lullabies. Something has been summoned, and it isn't satisfied with arrival. It needs roots. It needs repetition. The chant isn't finished until it's everywhere. So now he speaks no more. He simply thinks, and somewhere, someone else hears it. Then they knock, then they record, then they play it in reverse, and the circle begins again. It started as a curiosity, an audio file uploaded to a quiet forum where strange recordings were shared anonymously. The file had no name, just a symbol in the title that looked like a backwards. Most people ignored it. One listener didn't. He clicked play late at night, not expecting much, just static at first, followed by faint knocking, rhythmic, hollow, as if someone were knocking on wood from beneath the floor. The knocks didn't feel like they belonged to the house. They felt like they were trying to belong somewhere else. Then came the voice, garbled, reversed, distant. He paused the recording and replayed it backward, just to see. And that's when it spoke. Clear, precise, Latin, spoken with deliberate cadence. It was only one sentence, but it made his skin crawl, not from fear, from familiarity. Somehow he knew what it meant, even without translation. The phrase settled in his chest, like breath held too long. Over the next few days, things changed in subtle increments. Sounds didn't come from where they were supposed to. The dripping in the sink echoed through the ceiling. Footsteps upstairs felt like they were walking just under the floorboards. His voice on recordings developed a lag. He'd speak, but playback always showed him finishing early or late. At first, he chalked it up to software issues, maybe a glitch in the program, but the recordings kept getting longer, even when he didn't touch the mic. He'd press stop and find an extra 15 minutes tacked onto the end. Static, whispers, then a knock, always the knock. When he played those endings in reverse, the chant deepened, gained syllables, became something more complex. It wasn't just calling out anymore, it was responding to itself. His dreams shifted next. They came in pieces, never coherent. But certain symbols returned, mirrors reflecting black light, stairs that led down in loops, a door that opened backwards, and always, at the edge of the dream, a child knocking in a pattern. 3 knocks, then silence, then a giggle, warped and stretched like tape slowing down. In waking hours, he'd find himself humming without knowing what he was singing. It wasn't music, it was cadence, like remembering how a phrase feels in the mouth before it forms into words. He started avoiding his reflection. One morning he saw his mirrored self smile before he had. It wasn't playful, it was like the reflection was mocking his delay, eager to speak before he did. That day, he covered all the mirrors with old blankets. It didn't help. The reflection had already moved on. It now visited his phone screen, the black of the powered-off television, the glass surface of his coffee. He contacted someone from the forum, the original poster. The account no longer existed. Deleted, no history, no uploads, no trace, but the file remained. It couldn't be removed. He tried deleting it a dozen times. It always reappeared in his downloads, sometimes renamed to other reversed words. One version titled itself Porter, another Mors Aperta. The file grew larger each day, from a few megabytes to a full gigabyte overnight, as if it were collecting something, more audio, more silence. He tried uploading it again, this time to a private server to see what it contained. The waveform looked normal until the last 5 minutes. Then it exploded into patterns he hadn't seen before. Spikes, bursts, visual shapes resembling runes, symbols etched into sound. It looked like a language encoded in frequency. He tried slowing it down by 800%. What came through was unmistakable, a chant layered with multiple voices, including, without a doubt, his own, but he hadn't recorded himself. The thought infected his days. He stopped sleeping for more than an hour at a time. The knocks now came through, walls he knew didn't connect to any outside space. Once, while sitting on the floor, he placed his ear to the carpet and heard breathing, not his, not from above, from beneath. He tested it again, recording directly from the floor. Playback revealed a whisper looped underneath. 1 voice opens, 2 voices echo, 3 will make it walk. He repeated the phrase aloud, regretting it instantly. The moment he said the last word, a picture frame fell from the wall. Inside was no photograph, only a mirror shard, placed there unknowingly. His reflection in it had no mouth. He checked the real mirror, still covered, but that shard had shown something missing, something taken. He tried not to speak for the rest of the day, but the chant spoke through other things. The wind chimes outside shifted into reversed melodies. The pipes in the house groaned syllables. Even the silence between his own breaths started to sound like intention. When the priest came, it wasn't because he called for one. It was because someone left a card on his doorstep. Plain white, no text, only the imprint of a knock. 3 indentations pressed into the paper. The priest didn't introduce himself. just stepped in, uninvited, and said, "It's already inside, isn't it?" He tried to explain what he'd heard, what he'd seen. The priest didn't blink, just said quietly, "The chant is a key, but it unlocks nothing good." Then the priest placed a rosary on the ground, and it vibrated, hummed, almost sang. He whispered something in Latin, and the air tensed like it was resisting. When the prayer ended, the priest looked at him and said, "You're not the first, you won't be the last, but you're close to the mouth. Don't become the throat." Then he left, without taking the rosary. It kept vibrating for an hour, then cracked in half on its own. That night, the knocking became constant. It never stopped, not loud, just there behind walls, under furniture, from speakers that were turned off. It seemed to be pushing out from inside the wiring. He began unplugging everything, cutting cords, smashing outlets. But the sound stayed. In fact, it got clearer. He realized the knocking didn't need speakers. It had become part of his perception. Something behind the sound, something old, summoned by attention, by curiosity, by belief, had embedded itself in the very way he heard the world. It wasn't just knocking anymore. It was learning how to speak again, through him, with him. And as the stars outside began to flicker again, just like in the footage from before, he understood. He wasn't just hearing the chant, he was becoming it. The next morning, the air felt thicker, not humid, heavy. Each breath carried weight, like inhaling dust or memory. The world outside had turned too quiet. No bird song, no wind through trees, not even the soft buzz of distant traffic. Silence clung to everything, stretched over every object like a veil. When he spoke aloud, his own voice startled him. It echoed strangely, not in the room but behind his ears, as if it had bounced back from a place inside his skull. He checked his laptop again. The file now had a new title, Lingua Aperta. When opened, the waveform had changed into pulsing ridges, like something alive was breathing through the frequencies. No matter how many times he closed it, it reopened on its own, and each time it whispered a new phrase, some Latin, some older. The syllables curled unnaturally, clicking and hissing like a forgotten dialect, struggling to remember itself. He stopped playing it aloud, but it didn't matter anymore. He could hear it anyway. In the mirrorless house, something else had started to reflect. Screens, even when turned off, showed after images. The shape of his silhouette, but bent backward. His own body in impossible positions, like he was looking at a puppet caught mid-fall. It moved without sinking to his real body. He tested it, raised his arm. The screen version raised it slower, dropped his shoulders. The screen version tilted its head. The delay was gone. Now the figure was choosing its own movements, watching him, not reflecting him. He covered all the monitors with towels, but the shapes bled through, outlines visible beneath cloth, as though the screens themselves had developed memory. One night, he woke to the television flickering, despite being unplugged. A word had appeared across the static screen, Vosum. He didn't know whether it was a command or a warning, but he spoke it aloud, and the house exhaled. From that point forward, speech became fragile. Words he thought were his no longer sounded like him. He'd call out simple things. Hello, yes, stop. But they echoed back wrong, slurred, deeper, spoken as if from a second mouth that barely understood the words. When he tried recording his voice again, the audio would distort in real time. His voice reversed itself mid-sentence. and every recording ended with knocking. Not from the house, from his own throat. The priest's warning came back to him. Don't become the throat. He now understood. The chant didn't want attention. It wanted a vessel, something to speak through, and he had let it in. It wasn't possession in the traditional sense. It was linguistic, anatomical. Something older than language was building a nest inside his vocal cords, teaching his flesh a dialect that predated words. Some nights, he could feel it rehearsing, making subtle movements with his tongue while he slept, waking up with his jaw sore, as if he'd been speaking in dreams. The dreams became more vivid, not places but structures, endless tunnels lined with bone, doors made of mouths. One recurring symbol kept appearing, a spiral of knocked lines, some facing forward, some in reverse. He recognized the pattern. It was the waveform of the chant, etched like a maze. In one dream he followed the spiral inward, only to arrive at a chamber where a choir of eyeless children chanted in a voice that sounded like his, only older. They were singing the reversed phrase over and over, until the words collapsed into sobs. When he awoke, his pillow was soaked, not with sweat, but with saliva, more than he could have produced, as if something else had been using his mouth while he slept. That day he tried not to speak at all, but his phone began to ring. Unknown number. He didn't answer, but the voicemail came through anyway. Static, then knocking, then a voice whispering, "The third voice is ready." Paranoia turned inward. His body became alien. When brushing his teeth, he noticed his gums didn't bleed red anymore. The blood was dark, almost black, and thick like ink. When he coughed, the phlegm came out with flecks of dust, like ash. He checked his throat, in the mirror of his phone's camera. At the back of his mouth, just past the uvula, there was movement, pulsing, like a second tongue forming. He gagged, but when he tried to reach in and touch it, his fingers pulled back instinctively. His body resisted. That night, he recorded himself again while he slept. In the morning, the audio showed 6 hours of silence, until the final 20 seconds. That's when the knocking returned. This time, it was not from a surface. It was wet, like flesh tapping flesh from inside the body. The final sound was a voice whispering, "Open me." Desperate, he contacted a different priest, a scholar of dead languages. When he showed him the waveform, the priest paled. "This is pre-Vulgate Latin, but not classical. It's been twisted, like something using Latin as scaffolding to speak something else." When pressed, the priest revealed that the structure resembled invocation spells used in necromantic rites, not just to raise the dead, but to create interfaces between worlds. "The knocking is not a request," he said. "It's the sound of the door already opening." When asked what the full phrase meant, the one buried deepest in the reverse chant, the priest hesitated. "It says, 'My mouth is yours. Let your bones remember the first word.'" The scholar told him to burn the recording, destroy all technology, isolate himself, but he couldn't. The file wouldn't delete. And more importantly, it was no longer just a file. The chant lived in his body now, in his cadence, in his silence. On the final night, before he stopped sleeping altogether, he heard knocking from his own mouth while lying in bed. Not a cough, not a vocalization, a literal knock, sharp, clear, echoing against his own teeth. 3 knocks, then a hum, then a breath. As if something deeper was exhaling through him. He opened his mouth to scream, but what came out was not terror. It was a reversed sentence. his voice, but bent. It said, "We hear you." In that moment, the lights flickered off, the air pressure dropped, and every covered screen in the house turned on simultaneously, each showing a different version of him, each slightly out of sync. One smiled before he did, one blinked backward, and one mouthed the phrase, "It's your turn to listen." It began to follow him into silence. Even without speaking, the chant now lived in the spaces between his thoughts, not as words, but rhythm. He would stop mid-step, heart pounding, and realize the cadence of his own breathing matched the reversed knocking pattern. One short gasp, two held breaths, then repeat. Even sleep became fragmented. Dreams now bled into waking life. He would open his eyes and still see symbols drawn in breath on the windows, spirals, ancient curves etched in condensation that vanished before he could photograph them. He no longer trusted time. The clock hands spun normally, but hours felt like minutes, and seconds stretched long enough to hear voices forming inside them. Voices that didn't speak to him, but through him. As if he was a hallway now, echoing a conversation between things he couldn't see. The house had become the body, and he was just the echo. One night, while sitting in the dark, he heard a soft hum emerge from beneath the floorboards. Not a machine, not plumbing, a voice humming low, almost sad. He placed his ear to the hardwood, trembling. A phrase repeated, muffled and wet, like someone trapped underneath was singing through mud. It wasn't Latin anymore. It was raw syllables, older than grammar, primal, like a memory trying to speak. As he leaned closer, a knock echoed up through the floor from directly beneath him. He didn't flinch. He knocked back. 3 times. Pause. Once. Pause. Twice. A perfect mirror. The house responded immediately. Every light bulb blew out at once. And from the dark floor, a breath rose, not air but cold memory. Something remembered its own death. By morning, mirrors had started working again, but only partially. His reflection showed movement before action. He'd walk across the room, and his image would already be on the other side, waiting. When he blinked, the mirror version stared. It began speaking silently, forming words with its mouth that he couldn't hear, but he could understand. It wasn't language, it was meaning, pressed into his thoughts like fingerprints into wax. The mirror self mouthed one word over and over, "In here." Not in here, in here, to exist essentially within. He turned away and covered every reflective surface, but the idea stuck to his mind. What if the knocking wasn't a request to enter, but a reminder that it already had, that it never came in, it had always been here. Every surface in the house began responding. Cracks in the walls pulsed slightly, like veins. Doors no longer squeaked when opened. They breathed. The house had become vocal tissue, every floorboard a rib, every hallway a throat. And he was just the cough. He called the priest again, desperate for explanation. The older man's voice was tired and heavy with dread. "There are ancient orders," he explained, ones who believed that language was not created, but unearthed, that the first words were alive and had their own will. They weren't meant to be spoken aloud, only remembered by the dead. Your chant, it's one of them. When asked why playing it backward awakened something, the priest hesitated. Because the dead hear backward. That's the price of dying. Time reverses. So when you speak a chant in reverse, you don't repel them. You clarify it. You pronounce it in their direction. And if they remember the phrase, they follow it. The priest paused. You've become the instrument now. They'll keep speaking through you, until your mouth forgets who it belongs to. He warned him to stop responding, not to knock, not to listen, but the man had already passed that point. The mouth wasn't his anymore. Soon there were no more knocks, only replies. He would wake with bruises on his chest, perfectly round, as if fingertips had pressed gently in the night. He placed a camera at the foot of his bed to record himself. What it captured made his breath stop. At 3:12 a.m., his body sat up suddenly, eyes closed, mouth agape, and from his throat, knocking came, not from hands or movement, but from inside the body. A full sequence. 3, 1, 2. Then he spoke, but not in his voice. The tone was lower, gelatinous. The door is awake. Then he lay back down. The camera recorded no further movement. But in the final second of footage, the lens fogged slightly, and a second face could be seen briefly beside his. Not physical, a distortion of light, but its mouth was open, and it was mouthing along. Everything outside began decaying. Food rotted faster. Plants withered within hours. Flies began to swarm around the window frames, though none were ever seen entering. Animals avoided the property entirely. No birds, no squirrels, not even stray dogs. When he walked outside, the street looked normal, but the sky had dimmed. Not cloudy, just muted, like light itself was becoming less committed. He tried staying with a friend, far away, in a house with no devices. But on the first night, the old pipes in the bathroom began clicking. Knock, knock, reverse. The chant had become part of him. Distance didn't matter. Isolation was pointless. He was the ritual now, a vessel too late to close. The final warning came, not through sound, but in writing. Words began appearing on the walls, faint, chalky phrases that faded when touched. Remember me backward, the first word was last. Where memory ends, we begin. These phrases looped, changed slightly, then repeated, like a chant, trying to transcribe itself. One line stayed longer than the others. The mouth that opens last will never close. It stayed for hours, until sunlight touched it, and then it evaporated. That night, he tried one last experiment. He played the chant one final time, but this time, not backward, forward, normal speed. Nothing happened for a while. Silence, then behind him, a mirror uncovered itself. He hadn't moved. The cloth just fell. In the mirror, he wasn't alone. The mirror remained uncovered. No matter how many times he draped it, pinned it, or smashed it, the reflection always returned, sometimes from a different surface. A puddle, a darkened screen. Even the glint of a spoon once held his image, but twisted, like the metal itself was remembering him in pieces. The reflection now stared ahead while he moved, as if waiting for his thoughts to catch up. Then came the mimicry. He would whisper in frustration, short phrases, prayers, curses, and the reflection would repeat them backward, not just in speech, but in mouth movement. It had learned him, memorized the shape of his words, the pauses between his syllables. He wasn't seeing a mirror anymore. He was watching something rehearse how to be him, and it was getting better at it. Late one evening, the walls began humming. Not loud, not sudden. A low, vibrating hum like bones remembering a tune. Every corner of the house buzzed in unison, a harmony made of breath and air pressure. The floor felt like standing on a throat. He opened his mouth, involuntarily, and out came nothing. No voice, no scream. Only that same reversed knock, clicking up from his chest and through his teeth. His vocal cords burned as though memory itself had rubbed raw against them. He collapsed, struggling to breathe, as the knocking grew faster, more desperate, and the hum rose into a low chant, not from outside, not even from below. It was coming from within him. His lungs had learned the rhythm, and they were echoing back. He tried to write a message for help, but every letter reversed itself on the page. Not mirror writing, reversed intention. He'd start with, "Please help me," and end with "MPLACLP," his hand trembling, unaware until the words finished. It wasn't just his voice being used now, it was his will. He found himself dialing numbers without memory of why, ordering objects online he'd never used before. Mirrors, recorders, ink made from bone charcoal. He'd wake to deliveries on the porch. Inside the packages were folded notes, in unfamiliar handwriting, yet addressed to him. One note read, "Your mouth remembers, let it finish." He stopped answering the door after that, not because he feared what was out there, but because whatever was knocking was no longer outside. The priest tried to call again, but when the phone rang, the voice on the other end wasn't the priest's. It was his own voice, recorded, played backward, then looped. "It's already open. You are the chant." Over and over, the line cut out after exactly 66 seconds each time. No more, no less. He unplugged the phone, but it rang anyway. Every night at the same time. The doorbell joined in soon after. Then the hum started earlier in the day. Noon, then morning. Soon the house never stopped humming. The entire structure had become a living throat, and the silence between sounds felt louder than any scream. He stopped sleeping. When he blinked, he saw shadows twitch in rhythm. Even his dreams became rhythmic, knocking, chanting, then waking with dried blood under his nose. He was decaying slowly, from the inside out. He finally understood. It wasn't about summoning the dead. It was about making room for them. The reversed chant wasn't a call, it was a trade. For every time he responded, something less of him remained, like peeling skin, layer by layer. One morning, his reflection didn't follow him. It stayed still, eyes wide, mouth open, frozen mid-word. He backed away, breath quickening, but the reflection blinked. Then it smiled, first time it had ever smiled, and mouthed the chant perfectly forward. The reflection was no longer bound to movement. It had become the source. He watched it knock against the inside of the glass 3 times. Once, then it vanished, and the mirror shattered from within. The glass fell outward, toward him. Now the knocking happens in his sleep. Not from the walls, not from the floors, from inside his bones. A pulse, a code, a message. He doesn't speak anymore. His voice no longer answers to him, but the chant still plays. It repeats endlessly in his mind, backward and forward, folding over itself like breath upon breath. The priest never returned his final message. Perhaps he understood there was no redemption in this, only continuation. The chant is alive now. It lives in frequencies, in silence, in reflected memory. It doesn't knock to enter, it knocks to remind. It is inherent, and it waits in anyone who listens closely enough to the gaps between words. Anyone who rewinds sound just to see what's hidden underneath. Anyone who forgets that language, once reversed, may still be heard and may still respond. And so, the house is quiet again. From the outside, it looks untouched. A peaceful street, a normal door. But those who pass by feel it, an odd pulse in the air, like a heartbeat below concrete. They say if you stop and knock on that door 3 times, then once, then twice. You'll hear nothing. But when you walk away and listen to your footsteps in reverse, you'll swear they echo with another set. And sometimes, if you sleep nearby, you'll dream of a man who speaks in your voice, saying a Latin phrase you don't understand. You'll wake up breathless, then forget. But the breath you lost, the one you exhaled in the dream, that breath belongs to it now. And one day, when it's ready to chant again, it will use your voice to do it. The chant was never supposed to leave the house. That's what they all believed. The priest, the man who heard it first, even the ones who never said a word but kept the doors closed tight, convinced that silence could be a shield, but sound doesn't care about walls. And the chant wasn't really sound anymore. It was rhythm. It was memory. It was the space between thoughts that waits for something to echo back. It surfaced again in a university sound lab, an anonymous file in a cache of corrupted audio from a decades-old cassette archive. Just a timestamp, 3:12 a.m. A student, cataloging old reel-to-reels for digitization, pressed play out of boredom. Static greeted him first, then a distortion that stretched the speakers, not volume but shape. The sound bent the air. Then the knocking. He leaned in, played it backward, and the moment the Latin syllables emerged, he froze. He didn't understand the words, but he knew something had recognized him. The lights flickered. The waveform on his screen shifted, displaying a strange spiral. He blinked, and the pattern etched itself behind his eyelids like an afterimage. He saved the file without thinking, named it something generic, untitled _reverse, but the name wouldn't stick. Every time he reopened the file, it renamed itself. First to Resurgam, then to Vocar, then simply main. He tried to delete it. The screen froze. The speakers popped softly. When he restarted the system, the file was back. This time on the desktop, not in the folder. Then came the voice, his own, but reversed, reading back the file name. He hadn't spoken, hadn't recorded anything, but the file was reacting to his presence. He shut everything down, pulled the power from the wall, even disconnected the battery backup, but the laptop remained on. The screen stayed black, except for one line of white text. You listened, you belong. He left the lab that night and never went back. He started hearing the knocking in unrelated sounds, the drip of water in the shower, the beat of his sneaker soles against concrete, the rattle of the train underfoot. Each knock had meaning now. 3, 1, 2. He started knocking it back, at first as a joke, then as habit, then because something in him felt like not replying would leave something unanswered. His friends noticed the change. He'd drift off in the middle of conversations, smile at nothing, seem to respond to things no one else heard. He claimed to be fine, just distracted. But his voice sometimes carried the chant's rhythm, even in casual words. He once recited a coffee order in perfect reverse cadence. A barista pointed it out. He didn't remember doing it. At night he'd dream of staircases that turned in on themselves, mirrors with no reflection, children humming songs that made his ears bleed. And always, the phrase returned, spoken from nowhere. You are already open. He recorded himself sleeping, just once, left his phone by the bed, and let it run all night. The next morning, the file was over 6 hours long. He scrolled through it. Most of it was silence, breathing, the occasional shifting of blankets, until the 3:12 mark. That's when the knocking began. It came from inside the room. Sharp, hollow, 3, 1, 2. Then his voice deep, distorted. speaking Latin. When he tried to translate it, the phrase wasn't listed in any dictionary. He posted it online in a forum. Someone replied within seconds, "That's not Latin. It's a memory. Don't speak it out loud." The message disappeared moments later. His recording app glitched after that. Every time he tried to open the file again, the waveform was replaced with a spiral, not digital, not drawn, like the file had become a shape, a diagram of something not yet finished, and the spiral kept moving. He began experiencing gaps in time, short at first seconds, maybe a minute, then longer. He'd come to in different parts of the apartment, hands shaking, throat sore. One day he woke up to find a small speaker wired into the corner of his bedroom. He hadn't bought it, didn't recognize the brand. It played nothing until 3:12 a.m. Then it emitted a low hum, followed by the reversed knocking. Every night he destroyed it, burned it, but the hum began coming from the walls instead, not from the neighbors, from his wiring, the pipes, the outlets. Anything that had carried current now pulsed with the chance rhythm. He stopped using electricity altogether. Candles lit his evenings, but even then, the flame would flicker with the same timing. The chant had moved past devices. It had found the beat of the world itself. He went back to the lab, hoping to find the original tape, maybe erase it at the source. But the room had changed. New students, new supervisors. No one remembered him. He asked about the corrupted cassette batch. They showed him the archive, rows of shelves, empty. The section had been cleared last week. They said. He asked why. They looked confused. "There's never been a batch like that. Are you sure you were here?" He left, heart pounding. The lab didn't remember him. The system didn't either. When he checked the university records, his access credentials were gone. His student email deactivated. It was as if he'd never enrolled. That night, a box appeared on his doorstep. Inside, a cassette recorder, a single unlabeled tape, and a mirror shard wrapped in cloth. The tape had one word scratched into its side. "In here." He played it. Of course he did. And when the chant echoed from the speaker again, he didn't try to reverse it. He let it play forward. Let it flood the room. Let it coat his thoughts. The voice that followed was no longer his. Or maybe it was, but the part of him that belonged to sound. It whispered, "Your mouth remembers. Now your silence must forget." And then the voice spoke again, but this time from behind him. He turned around. No one there, but the mirror shard had shifted. It no longer reflected him. It reflected a room that wasn't his own. A hallway, someone else's bedroom. And in the distance, barely visible in the reflection, was a child holding a recorder, humming the chant. The mirror never changed back. No matter how many times he moved it, broke it, buried it, it would show the same thing. An unfamiliar bedroom, empty most of the time, but occasionally flickering with movement. Sometimes it was a child sitting still on the edge of a bed. Sometimes it was a woman staring at a closet door. They never looked at the mirror, never acknowledged him, and yet he felt them watching through it. He covered it with blankets, sealed it in a crate, but each night the crate would shake, not violently, but rhythmically. Knock, knock, silence, knock. The pattern always returned. 3, 1, 2. He stopped trying to sleep. The knocking wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a pulse he could feel in his teeth, in his bones, in the brief silences between his own heartbeats. He didn't know when he had last eaten. His calendar still showed the same date, the day the cassette arrived. He found others. People online, deep in corners of forums long abandoned, whose stories echoed his own. They didn't call it a chant, or a ghost, or a curse. They called it the rhythm. Some described hearing it in old radios, others in the dead frequencies between TV channels. One claimed it lived in their grandmother's lullaby. Another swore the family fridge whispered it when the power cut out. All the stories ended the same, with silence being too silent, with reflections no longer sinking, with the knocking turning inward. They all warned not to follow it, not to speak it aloud, but most of the posts had been deleted. Only fragments remained. One thread had no text at all, just an image of a child's drawing. A black door on a spiral staircase, a stick figure standing in front of it, 3 knocks drawn in red. Above it, written in shaky letters, "I didn't let it in, it let me out." He stopped recording, stopped trying to prove it. It wasn't proof he needed. It was unproving, the act of unknowing what had already been learned. But forgetting wasn't an option anymore. He began seeing the knocks in things. Car blinkers repeating the rhythm, elevator dings aligning with it. Even his own breath began syncing to the cadence. When he held his breath, the knocking stopped. But the moment he exhaled, it returned, louder, as if his silence was a gap the chant wanted to fill. That's when he started speaking backward, at first by accident, then as protection. Something about reversing the chant felt like armor. But the more he did it, the less his own words made sense. The language he spoke began sounding like pieces of the chant, and every sentence felt like an invitation in disguise. He began avoiding conversations. People said he stared too long, that his voice made their heads ache. He couldn't remember what normal speech felt like. The mirror in the crate shattered on its own. No force, no impact, just the sound of glass splitting softly one morning. He found the pieces scattered on his floor, each one reflecting a different version of the same hallway, different lighting, different doors. One fragment showed a hospital corridor, another, a child's bedroom with the blinds drawn shut. One showed nothing but darkness, except for a hand resting on the window, palm pressed against invisible glass. None of the reflections matched his apartment. He taped over them, but the reflections bled through the adhesive like oil through cloth. That night, he turned off every light, sat in the center of the room, and waited. And when the knocking started again, it came not from the walls, but from inside the floor beneath him. A low vibration, a call, a rhythm that expected a response. He whispered the chant for the first time, completely, in one breath. Not backward, not aloud, just mouthed it. As soon as he did, the power in the building went out. The windows turned opaque. Not black, just void. The air changed. Pressure shifted like something large had stepped into the room without making a sound. The reflection in the floorboards flickered, and in that warped shine, he saw himself, but not as he was, thinner, eyes blacked out, mouth open, speaking the chant without pause. This version of him stared directly back. Then it knocked, first on the floor, then on his chest. He felt it like a heartbeat that didn't belong to him. He tried to get up, but his body wouldn't move. His limbs weren't frozen. They were simply listening, obeying. The chant, once a sound, had become a command. He found himself outside his apartment the next day. No memory of walking, keys in his hand, mirror shard in his pocket. It reflected a playground this time, empty swings, overcast sky, a single child spinning in circles, eyes closed. The chant was in the wind. He threw the shard into traffic, but it vanished. Mid-air, didn't land, didn't break, just wasn't there anymore. And yet that night, it was back under his pillow. This time, it showed a new reflection. A room, lit only by candles, walls covered in pages from books he'd never seen. Latin, Hebrew, symbols etched in ash. Someone sitting in the center, cross-legged, chanting in reverse. Their face blurred, their body motionless, but the mouth never stopped. And above them, drawn in smoke on the ceiling, the same spiral returned. Only now it pulsed, glowing faintly in rhythm with the knock. He felt tears on his face. Not sadness, not fear. Something older. A grief without origin. He realized then, the chant wasn't hunting. It was reaching, searching, not for victims but vessels. A continuity. A host for memory, not information, but sensation. It wasn't about knowing Latin or hearing the tape. It was about feeling incomplete enough to listen, to let something older fill the hollow. The knocking wasn't an intrusion. It was a rehearsal, a practice for the moment someone said, "Come in," and maybe he already had. Maybe that moment wasn't recorded. Maybe it wasn't a word, but a feeling, the willingness to unlearn reality, to allow rhythm to take the place of reason. He no longer feared it, but he didn't trust it either. It didn't ask for obedience. It waited for collapse. And when it came, it would step forward, not as a monster, but as a memory shaped like a person. The first to notice the change wasn't him. It was his sister. She called out of nowhere, after months of silence, her voice soft, careful. She said she'd been having strange dreams, not nightmares, not exactly, just repetitions. Always the same hallway, always the same 3 knocks. She'd wake up before reaching the door, but each time, the knocking came a little closer. She thought it was stress, maybe even inherited. Their mother used to speak in her sleep, repeating names that no one remembered. Their grandmother too whispers in Latin, they'd said, though no one in the family knew the language. But it was her final sentence that made his breath stop cold. I found a tape in Mum's old things, just static at first. But when I reversed it, he interrupted her, demanded she stop, told her to burn it. She didn't understand his panic, only laughed nervously, but he knew it had found another path. He didn't sleep again for days. Every hour, he could feel something moving behind his eyes, not physically, but like an echo of a shape. His thoughts began to blur, his memories out of sequence. He'd walk into rooms and not remember how he got there. He'd hear his name being spoken in recordings he never made. The chant had found a deeper way in, not through fear, but through familiarity. It mimicked his voice in voicemails, altered pictures in his phone, slight changes at first. A clock hand turned backward, a shadow that didn't match the light source. Then came the real horror, a photo from childhood that had never existed. Him standing at a spiral staircase, hand on the door, and behind him, something tall, featureless, not touching, just watching. His parents were both dead, but now their voices were leaving voicemails, whispering only one sentence, "It's time to answer." The neighbors started hearing things too, knocking that didn't stop, children humming unfamiliar tunes. A woman from down the hall came knocking on his door, asking if he'd heard it too. When he opened it, she stared, not at him but past him, as if the room behind him was somehow bigger, darker, deeper than it should be. She asked who else lived there. When he said no one, she shook her head, eyes wide. "But someone else answered," she whispered, backing away. That night, the building lost power again. All the doors in the hallway creaked open, one by one, without wind, without force, just a sequence, a rhythm, as if the building itself had been listening. and now it was responding. The fire alarms chirped in a strange pattern. The plumbing pulsed. Even the elevator, when called, would arrive with no one inside, but always descending from a floor that didn't exist. He found himself unable to remember key things: how to spell his name, the faces of his parents, the date. His clocks all froze at different times, yet moved when he wasn't watching. He caught his own reflection, mouthing words he hadn't said. The spiral symbol began to appear, not just in dreams, but in the frost on the window, in coffee rings, in the knots of wood on his floor. He took photos, but the spiral never showed. Only he could see it. And once, just once, he looked out the window and saw himself staring back from the sidewalk below, completely still, head tilted, waiting. When he blinked, the figure was gone, but the knocking had moved to the windows now. Glass doesn't echo knocks the same way. It shudders, it trembles, and it bleeds sound inward. Desperate, he returned to the priest. But this time, the priest didn't speak. He stared at him in silence for a long moment, then finally asked, "Have you spoken it willingly?" When he said yes, the priest closed his eyes, told him the chant was never meant to summon a thing. It was meant to summon absence, a vacuum that once opened could not be closed, because it doesn't take, it replaces, it does not invade. The priest said, "It overwrites. What comes isn't evil. It's a hunger without desire, a presence shaped by those who remember the forgotten. It comes when there's enough silence to hear memory as a voice." The priest said his only hope now was to mislead it, to forget himself faster than it could learn him, to drown it in unfamiliarity, do nothing in pattern, sleep at noon, write backward, eat in the dark. But then the priest stopped. His eyes turned upward, then to the side. "It's listening now," he whispered, "even to us." He moved out that night, but the knocking followed, in hotel walls, on parked cars, in birdsong, in power lines swaying without wind. And worse, people started responding. An old man at the gas station whispered, "Come in," under his breath, and then collapsed. A child in a grocery aisle hummed the rhythm and stared into an unplugged monitor, smiling. A woman on the bus said, "It's already inside you," and then began sobbing, covering her ears. He wasn't the center of it anymore. The chant had spilled beyond him. It was spreading, not like a disease, but like an old word remembered across too many minds at once. And the more people heard fragments, the more the world began to bend. Technology failed. Maps glitched. People forgot familiar streets. And in every distortion, there was the knock. 3, 1, 2, call, pause, answer. He no longer heard it, just in the dark. It was now between moments, between the blinking of lights, the buffering of videos, the silence before a phone call connects. That was when it struck him. The chant was never meant to be heard in full, not aloud. Its full power came in fragments, spread across the masses like ash in the wind. Too much to be noticed, just enough to take root. He was only the first to say it completely, but others had said parts, and the chant only needed enough. It wasn't summoning one being, it was summoning the old silence, the one that came before language, the one that filled the world before people tried to name it. And now it had found a way in, through names forgotten, rhythms remembered, and voices willing to open doors they didn't understand. The final message arrived without sound. His phone screen lit up at 3:33 a.m., displaying a file he hadn't downloaded. No name, no sender, just a black waveform and the timestamp looping endlessly. He stared at it for what felt like hours, his fingers hovering but unwilling to press play. But he knew he would. Just like he'd always known the chant wasn't meant to be heard from others, It was meant to be remembered by him. When he finally pressed it, there was nothing. No knock, no whisper, no chant, just static. But beneath that static was the hum of breath. A long, shallow inhale. Then nothing. The room felt heavy. The walls didn't creak. They settled, like something had finally taken its place inside them. He looked around and understood that the recording hadn't sent him a message. It had sent him absence, and the moment he played it, he gave it a name. From that moment, the outside world seemed too loud. The city itself roared with confusion. People walked backward without noticing. Music stuttered in radios. Conversations repeated with perfect inflection, word for word, like rehearsals of memories. Across the news and internet, strange things were reported. Mass sleepwalking, power grids failing in symmetrical patterns, people missing time in exact 4-minute intervals. But no one knew where to point. Some said it was solar flares. Others blamed a virus or mass hysteria. But no one understood the truth. It wasn't what was causing it. It was who had heard it first. The chant, when reversed, wasn't a message to bring something in. It was a command for everything else to stop making sound. And the more people joined the silence, the more the world forgot how to resist it. He no longer recognized the face in his mirror. Not because it had changed, but because the man in the glass didn't blink with him anymore. It stared, unblinking, unmoving, until he looked away. The spiral appeared again behind him, this time etched into the condensation of his bathroom wall. But he hadn't showered. He hadn't used water. The room had made the steam on its own, to draw it again. It had become a symbol, not of invitation, but of completion. And when he tried to wipe it away, his fingers passed through it, like it was light. That night, someone knocked at his door, not in panic, not in question, just once. And when he opened it, no one was there. But the hallway beyond had changed. There were too many doors. Some stood open to impossible angles. Others were gone entirely. At the far end stood a child humming 3 notes, then 1, then 2. She smiled without teeth and said, "We all answered." He wandered after that, not from madness but from necessity. He couldn't stay anywhere long. Every place began to echo with the knock within hours of his arrival. Motel floors buckled, walls pulsed with breathing. People began to avoid him, not out of suspicion, but instinct. Animals fled when he passed. Streetlights flickered in patterns that matched the chant's rhythm. Then the weather changed. Rain fell upward. Trees swayed in still air. Gravity became a question. He once dropped his keys and watched them hover a moment before choosing the wrong direction. It wasn't just the chant that had crossed into the world. It was the logic behind it. The rules of sound, time, reflection were bending toward whatever had answered. And he couldn't undo it, because he had already become part of the chant. It was no longer separate from him. It was in his memory, in his voice, and worst of all, in his silence. He returned to his old home one last time, not to escape, but to finish what had begun. The place was hollow now. Every picture frame was empty, every drawer full of dust. But the basement door was open, and from it came the sound, not of knocking, but of shuffling, like a crowd standing still turning toward him. He descended slowly, holding no light. He didn't need it. The spiral glowed faintly along the walls now, pulsing with his heartbeat. At the bottom, he found the tape recorder, but it wasn't plugged in. It wasn't powered. Still, it played. Not audio, but presence. He felt it like heat, like memory, like standing at the threshold of something older than language. The air pulsed once, and he understood. He was never meant to record the chant. He was meant to repeat it, and when he whispered it, the air didn't echo. It accepted. There was no flash, no scream, no crack in the world. The change was soft, total, instant. Somewhere, clocks stopped, not by force, but by agreement. The knocking ceased, not because it was over, but because it had arrived. People across the world blinked and forgot why they were afraid. The spiral faded from view, not erased, but fulfilled. Those who had heard the chant now moved differently, quietly, deliberately. They answered to no one, but they understood each other. No governments fell, no wars began, but something older than belief now threaded itself through every silence, every breath held too long, every moment of forgetfulness. And at the center of it stood a man who no longer knew his name, but remembered every note of the reversed knock. He had become its final syllable, its closing sentence. The chant did not end with him, it became him. Some say you can still hear it, not in the wind or static, but in silence itself, a room too quiet, a call that disconnects before you answer, an unfinished sentence you suddenly forget. That is where it lives now. It doesn't need sound to survive. It only needs space, inside memory, inside hesitation, inside your breath, right now, as you read this. The knocking isn't a request, it's a declaration, and once it's been spoken, once you've thought it, once you've felt that pull to pause, to wonder, to listen, you've already opened the door. It began with stillness, not a moment of calm, but a heaviness that settled across entire cities. People began noticing things in their periphery, a movement that stopped when they turned their heads, shadows shaped like memories that didn't belong to them. Trains halted between stations, their engines functional, but the conductors unsure why they'd stopped. Children spoke less, laughed less, and when they were asked why, they simply looked confused and said, "It's not time to talk yet." Hospitals filled with patients who heard knocking in their sleep. Every account was identical. 3 knocks, then 2, then 1, in reverse. Doctors called it a mass auditory hallucination, but couldn't explain how so many heard the same sequence. But those who'd heard the reverse chant knew. The silence wasn't peace, it was attention. The world had listened to something it shouldn't have, and now something was listening back. News anchors stuttered mid-sentence and blinked as if waking from long dreams. Entire radio broadcasts looped a few seconds of dead air before resuming, always beginning again with the phrase, "We return." One man uploaded a video claiming he could still hear the reverse chant playing faintly in his walls. Within hours, his home was declared unsafe and sealed off. No one went in, but each night the front door opened itself at 3:33 a.m. The local paper stopped reporting it after the 4th time. Meanwhile, reports of mirrored breathing increased, stories where people claimed their own reflections inhaled when they hadn't. A girl in Brazil posted footage of her ceiling fan spinning counterclockwise with no power. The sound it made when played backward matched the frequency of the original chant. The spiral was no longer a symbol, it had become a signature. Those who saw it, drawn in frost, steam, ash, were marked, and those who remembered it were watched. Religious communities tried to respond, but their rituals failed. Holy water boiled in still bowls, crucifixes inverted without touch. A group of monks tried to chant a counter-prayer, but found their voices falling into the reversed pattern instead, as if their throats were being guided. One priest, who had studied ancient liturgical Latin for decades, made a quiet statement before vanishing. It is not summoning us, we are its echo. His disappearance was never officially investigated. All that remained in his study was a metronome, tapping backward. In places where the knocking was strongest, animals refused to enter. Birds avoided entire rooftops. Cats hissed at empty rooms. Dogs sat staring at corners for hours, heads tilted, listening for something their owners could not hear. No sound recordings captured what they heard, but in the silence the timestamp always glitched. 0 hours 3 minutes and 21 seconds, and when reversed, it displayed 12 hours 30 minutes and 0 seconds. Noon became a threshold. Shadows began pointing the wrong direction. The sun no longer felt warm at midday. It felt observed. Inside homes, subtle changes began. Refrigerators hummed in rhythms. Televisions flickered with static at precisely 3-second intervals. Some households reported hearing faint chanting beneath their floorboards, others from behind mirrors. No one dared investigate beyond the first noise, because the second was always closer. Entire families left their homes with no explanation, leaving food on the table and lights on. Neighbors said they walked out in silence, hands clasped, eyes fixed forward. Not afraid called. Government agencies denied involvement, but cordoned off entire neighborhoods. Black vans rolled through towns, staying only long enough for the silence to deepen. Online forums tried to connect the dots, but every thread about reverse knocking eventually ended the same way, with the original poster deleting their account or never logging in again. Some said the chant, once heard, rewrote memory itself, that it could live inside the idea of silence, that once you suspected it, you carried it. He had been silent since returning from the basement, not mute, quiet. Words felt heavy now, dangerous even, as if speech gave shape to things better left unformed. He no longer heard the chant aloud, but in the absence of sound, in pauses between thoughts, in the hush before someone entered a room. The spiral was on his ceiling now, barely visible, unless you tilted your head just right. He never touched it. It pulsed when he breathed. Not every breath, just the ones he tried to hold. Something had taken root in him, not as possession, but as permission. He hadn't just heard the chant, he had understood it, and now it lived inside his perception of silence. He knew the rules had changed, not for everyone, but for those like him, those who had heard the knock and turned around too slowly, those who still thought they were alone. In the early days he tried to warn people. He showed them the spiral, he played the reversed recording, but no one believed. Or worse, they pretended not to. Some smiled too long after hearing it. Others blinked in sequence with the knock. A few leaned closer, their voices slow, saying, "We already answered." That's when he knew the chant had done more than summon. It had chosen. Those marked weren't just listeners, they were amplifiers, and as their numbers grew, so did the stillness. Sound no longer had weight in certain places. Entire buildings fell silent during storms. Schools dismissed children early when the bell rang backward. Microphones stopped working in churches. He once saw a crowd of people pause mid-conversation, turn to face the same direction, then resume as if nothing had happened. They weren't sleepwalking, they were aligning. Then came the new knock. Not reversed, not loud. Just one soft tap, at random, from behind walls, beneath feet, inside closets. It never repeated. It didn't want acknowledgement. It just wanted to exist. And everyone who had once heard the reversed chant began to recognize it. The first knock was not the beginning of a message. It was the reply. Whatever had answered was now speaking back. Not in words, but in patterns, in absence. In stillness, he began recording silence again, desperate to detect the reply. Each time, the waveform was blank. But when he reversed it, there it was, a breath, a syllable, a single word, uttered with no mouth. Again, the summoning had not finished. It had only opened the first gate. The knocking was not just a chant, it was syntax, and the dead were learning how to speak again. It started with the mirrors. They no longer reflected movements naturally. A gesture made in front of glass took half a second too long to echo back. At first, people blamed fatigue, lighting, tricks of the mind, but it spread. Entire cities began reporting inconsistencies, reflections that lingered after the person had moved away, eyes that blinked once more than they should have. For those who had heard the reversed chant, the mirror didn't just lag, it watched, and eventually, it responded. One man posted a video of himself waving, and the reflection raised the wrong hand, not reversed, just different. He was never seen again. Soon after, bathroom mirrors fogged in spirals, even when no one showered. Mirrors in elevators cracked at precisely 3:33 p.m., but only on the inside. And in certain homes, mirror images smiled when no one was smiling. They weren't imitating anymore. They were becoming independent. Sleep changed. Dreams grew longer, heavier and harder to wake from. Those who heard the chant reported dreaming in reverse, events playing backward, as if memory were unraveling itself to make room. A woman confessed to falling asleep and waking up 2 days earlier. She didn't dream, she remembered forward. Some reported knocking from inside their pillows. One boy whispered that he saw someone standing in the hallway in his sleep, but it was himself, slightly older, mouthing the chant backward. Time began folding in strange ways. Watches ticked backward for an hour, and then resumed as if nothing had happened. Phones vibrated with voicemails that disappeared before they could be played. The spiral appeared on phone screens, only visible when the brightness was turned all the way down. These weren't glitches, they were rehearsals. The chant was learning how to inhabit the world through its listeners, and those listeners were no longer sure which version of themselves they still were. The second knock came again. 3 nights in a row, always soft, always alone. But each time, it happened closer. The first was from the attic, the second from the bedroom wall, the third from inside the headboard. It was no longer testing thresholds, it was nesting. Soundproofing didn't stop it. Noise machines stuttered during its presence. One couple tried sleeping with headphones in, only to wake and find the earbuds placed neatly on their nightstand, coiled in a spiral. One elderly man sealed off every wall in his home with padding, only to hear the knock from inside his chest. Doctors found nothing wrong, but on his final scan, the bones of his ribcage formed a distinct spiral around his heart. He died without speaking, but the last thing he wrote was a question. If knocking opens the door, what happens when we become the door? No one had an answer. Religious scholars tried to offer comfort, but their prayers became echoes, not metaphorically, literally. Recorded sermons played backward began to sync with the chant's rhythm. A rabbi reciting a protection prayer stumbled mid-phrase, looked behind him, and said quietly, "It's not evil, it's returning." An imam in Istanbul declared the chant an ancient rhythm found buried in pre-Abrahamic tombs. His mosque was sealed within the week, not by officials but by worshippers. They said the minarets had begun humming. A spiral had formed in the dust of the prayer rugs. Attempts to cleanse homes made things worse. Holy oil boiled away. Smudging with sage caused mirrors to crack. A woman attempted to burn her audio device, and when she replayed the flames, their crackling was the chant in perfect tempo. Fire, water, smoke. They all carried the message now. The elements were no longer neutral. They were mediums. Children began drawing spirals compulsively, not in random doodles but in precise mathematical swirls. One teacher noticed all her students, without speaking to each other, began filling the margins of their test papers with identical spirals. She took the drawings home and arranged them, accidentally completing a larger spiral across 30 sheets. That night, her clock spun counterclockwise, and her reflection blinked twice for every time she blinked once. She didn't return to school. In a different city, a teenager sculpted a perfect spiral out of his fingernail clippings. When asked why, he replied, "It told me how." Parents grew fearful. Some children didn't speak for days. Others whispered backwards Latin in their sleep. One child said the chant gave him a homework answer, and it was always right, but only if he let it hum inside him first. This wasn't possession, it was education. The chant wasn't feeding off innocence, it was preparing it. Then came the chanting in crowds, not from mouths but from ambient silence. Places with large gatherings, concerts, protests, stadiums, began experiencing audio failures. But when recordings were reversed, the chant was there, always underneath, always gaining clarity. One security camera picked up a large crowd, freezing for 11 seconds at a parade. When reversed, their collective steps formed a perfect spiral path. Not planned, not choreographed. A response. Governments began drafting emergency sound ordinances. But sound wasn't the enemy anymore. Order was. Anything that had rhythm could be rewritten. Dancers lost sync and mirrored each other unnaturally. Factory machines began tapping out reversed beats. Morse code operators heard full sentences in their static. A pilot swore the clouds formed a spiral pattern across 5 miles of flight. Instruments detuned themselves during concerts. Even random noise now had intent. The chant had evolved past audio. It had found its way into pattern itself. He felt it worst at night, not as fear but as closeness, as if the spiral now pulsed just beneath his skin. Sometimes he'd catch himself tapping his fingers to the reversed rhythm without realizing. Sometimes when he breathed out slowly, it wasn't his breath he felt returning. It was something else, sighing back in sync. He avoided mirrors, he unplugged his devices. But silence was no longer empty, it was always full. The chant lived in the negative space between sounds, and that space was expanding. Once he counted the knocks backward out loud, to try and reclaim control. 3, 2, 1, nothing happened. But hours later, his reflection mouthed the same numbers when he wasn't looking. The chant no longer needed to be played. It existed now, in thoughts, in hesitation, in the moments between questions and answers, and worst of all, in curiosity. Every time someone asked, "What is that sound?" it grew stronger. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't defense. The first time someone repeated the knock, it was an accident, a child tapping on the floor to match a pattern they couldn't stop humming. But the sound answered back, softer, closer. A second knock, identical in rhythm, echoed from the wall. The child smiled, not out of joy, but recognition, as if something had always been there, waiting for the right signal. The news dismissed it. But that same day, a dozen other reports came in. People mimicking the rhythm unconsciously, A man drumming on his steering wheel, a woman stirring soup, a student clicking a pen. None of them remembered doing it. The chant had slipped past fear and into instinct. The spiral was no longer something people saw. It was something they replicated in idle motion, in thoughtless habit. And each time someone mirrored it, the presence drew nearer. No longer summoned, welcomed. Phones became doorways. Not in the supernatural sense, but through influence. Autoplaying videos with distorted background rhythms, reels and loops, syncing perfectly with reversed audio patterns. One user posted a slowed-down video of their baby monitor, where the lullaby glitched, and underneath, layered into the melody, the chant emerged. It wasn't hidden. It had been designed in. Comments poured in. I hear it too. It's calming. Makes me feel less alone. That was the terrifying part. It didn't frighten everyone anymore. For many, it felt familiar, comforting. People shared reversed recordings like urban legends, but with a reverence. One post read, "It's not summoning something else. It's summoning us." Those who listened too often began reporting a strange sensation, like déjà vu stretched into entire hours. Moments replaying backward before reality snapped forward again. The spiral wasn't intruding. It was rewriting presence. Public spaces adjusted. In a museum, security footage showed a crowd walking in a continuous spiral around an empty sculpture base. When asked, they couldn't explain why. In cafes, music playlists began looping a strange undertone, barely audible, but rhythmically consistent with the chant. Office buildings reported elevator malfunctions where every button pressed led to floor 3, then 3 again, then 3 again. Some passengers said the doors opened not into hallways, but into darkness filled with faint knocking. But these were not isolated. Across cities, infrastructure behaved oddly. Crosswalk signals blinking in reverse, streetlights flickering in spiraled intervals, surveillance footage showing individuals staring at blank walls for minutes, only to continue walking without breaking stride. And yet, life continued, not with panic, with quiet resignation, because no one could point to what had changed. They just knew everything had. Conversations altered, language subtly bent. People spoke in broken sequences, as if thinking backwards and filling in logic after. One woman said her husband began answering questions she hadn't asked yet. Another claimed her therapist nodded before she spoke, and only responded with words she had already written in her journal the night before. Text messages arrived, time-stamped minutes before they were sent. A radio broadcast aired an emergency warning that was never actually delivered. The chant wasn't just sound anymore. It was timing. It existed between cause and effect, folding causality, like pages in a book, until nothing was linear anymore. And still no one screamed, because in their bones people felt something ancient and inevitable. They began calling it the answer. Not out loud, but inwardly, as if all their lives they'd been asking a question they didn't know they'd asked. The chant was simply what arrived in reply. Religions fractured, not through disbelief, but through redefinition. Some interpreted the chant as a long-lost divine frequency, an echo from creation itself. Others believed it was a doorway to memory, not death. "We aren't being haunted," one preacher said. "We're being reminded." Services began incorporating silence into sermons. Spirals appeared in stained glass and were justified as divine geometry. A new faith bloomed, not centralized, but spreading, carried by implication more than doctrine. It needed no name. It had rhythm. People no longer asked what the knocking was. They asked how long it had been there, waiting. and why they only heard it now. In temples, prayers began ending with soft taps. Once, twice, then a third, slower knock. No one knew who started it, but no one stopped it either. Because deep down, whether they admitted it or not, people had begun to recognize the pattern. And what we recognize, we embrace. Memory twisted next. People remembered things they had never experienced, but remembered them in detail, entire lifetimes of moments that didn't belong to them. A man in France described a recurring vision of tending a garden in a city that never existed. A woman in Canada recalled dying at sea in the 1300s without ever studying history. Children spoke of tunnels lined with spirals, of voices that weren't scary, just ancient. The chant was uncoiling memory, not individually, but collectively. Not past lives, but shared origins. People no longer asked, "What is it?" They whispered, "Is this who we were before forgetting?" The spiral wasn't growing, it was revealing, like a fingerprint pressed into consciousness. And each knock was not an intrusion, but a reminder. The chant hadn't come from the outside. It had come from underneath, rising, waiting for us to knock back. By the time the final knock echoed inside the collective silence, there were no more questions. The spiral had passed from image to sound, to movement, to thought. Now, it was the rhythm. It didn't erase identity, it wove itself through it. Like breath, like heartbeat. A man woke one morning, looked in the mirror, and instead of a reflection, saw himself from 3 seconds ago, blinking, breathing, smiling back with delayed affection. And behind that self, another. He smiled, not in fear, but in recognition. The knocking hadn't been from something waiting outside. It was us, calling ourselves back to the beginning, back to rhythm, back to origin. The chant was never meant to summon the dead. It was meant to remind the living. And now, the chant was everywhere, not playing, not echoing, just being, in the breath between words, in the pause before action, in the silence we no longer feared, because it was finally full. The final knock didn't come with thunder or trembling windows. It came with stillness, the kind of stillness that presses behind the eyes. People stopped mid-sentence, mid-step, mid-thought. Clocks blinked in unison. Traffic paused without reason. Airplane altimeters froze. Surveillance systems recorded frames where no movement occurred. Just people, standing perfectly still, as though time had inhaled and refused to exhale. In that silence, it wasn't the knock they heard. It was the absence of it, like a breath that had been present their entire lives, only now withdrawn. And in that vacuum, something stepped forward, not loud, not violent, but sure, like a memory remembered at last. The chant was no longer reverse or forward. It just was. Not sound, not language, just presence. Across the world, the spiral reappeared, not etched, not drawn, but formed in patterns of motion. Birds flew in slow orbit, never scattering. Clouds curled around invisible centers. Human traffic unconsciously curved through intersections, making loops instead of turns. Algorithms mapping city movement began showing spirals as dominant traffic flow, not imposed, chosen. No one instructed this behavior. People simply moved that way, as if led, not by logic, but rhythm. In schools, children drew spirals without prompt, not because they had seen them, but because their hands remembered how. Spiral-shaped birthmarks began to appear, tiny, faint, almost invisible, unless looked for, and once seen, impossible to unsee. The presence, wasn't just beside them anymore. It was within. It had been invited so many times through repetition, recognition, and imitation, that now it didn't need to knock. It had been answered. Some began to vanish, but not like a disappearance, more like integration. A man recorded his reflection waving independently, then stopped appearing entirely in photos. A woman spoke to herself in a mirror until her voice replied in a tone older than her years. And then, one morning, the mirror showed only an empty room. Their loved ones didn't mourn. They didn't forget either. It was as though a part of them had become inward-facing, not dead, but pulled beneath the surface. And yet, memories of them remained sharp, familiar, close. People left rooms with the sense that someone was still walking behind them, not as a threat, but as returning history. As if those who had vanished weren't gone, they were returned to origin, drawn fully into the spiral. The chant had never been about fear. It was about arrival. By now, the spiral no longer needed symbols or audio to express itself. It moved through sensation. People described feelings of being watched, but not by something external. They said they felt watched by their own lives, as if their memories were observing them from behind their actions. Time itself began to thin in places. Some woke up knowing tomorrow's conversations. Others fell asleep and dreamed of yesterday's news reports, word for word. The spiral was breaking chronology gently, turning linear time into rhythm. And as rhythm replaced order, people started speaking in fragments, but understanding each other more fully. There was no panic, only a deepening calm. The chant had become universal, not because it conquered, but because it resonated. It was the same pattern that beats in the womb, the same echo in every lullaby, the same cadence in every final breath. It was the rhythm of returning. One group of scientists attempted to isolate the chant's waveform in a vacuum chamber, but what they recorded wasn't sound, it was vibration from inside their bones. They concluded it wasn't environmental, it was biological, and not newly introduced, but reawakened. One of them wrote in her notes, "We're not reacting to the chant, we're remembering it." The moment she published that paper, she vanished. Her lab chair still warm, her clothes folded, a spiral drawn inside her notebook, unfinished. But no foul play was found. She had simply ceased to occupy space. Yet every future paper on the chant referenced her conclusions, as if she had never disappeared at all. Her colleagues still spoke of her in the present tense, without realizing it. The chant wasn't erasing, it was blending, and reality no longer demanded that presence be visible to remain true. Then came the final sign. Across every major city, at exactly 3:33 a.m., all sound ceased, not muted, absorbed. Not a bird chirped, not a car alarm rang. The earth exhaled silence, and in that deafening hush, the knock returned. But this time, not from walls or doors. It came from within. People felt it in their chests. A low, resonant thump, once, twice, 3 times, perfectly spaced, perfectly timed, a knock from inside the self. A reminder that the door was never outside. It had always been inward. The chant had not crossed over to us. We had crossed into it. And the final knock was not a warning. It was a welcome, a signal that the spiral was complete, and what had been summoned had not come from beyond death, but from beyond forgetting. We were never haunted. We were only homesick. And then, peace. The chant no longer needed to be heard, because it had become understood. There were no more manifestations, no more vanishing, only stillness, and a shared feeling of belonging to something far older than explanation. People resumed their lives, but differently, slower, with more pauses, with more silence. Not from fear, from reverence. They didn't fear the knock anymore. Some even tapped it softly before falling asleep, not to invite anything in, but to say, "I remember you." The spiral had done what it was always meant to do, not consume, not destroy, but bring back together. Not summon the dead, but return the living to meaning, in every pause, in every breath, in every heartbeat. Now lives the memory of the chant. It does not echo. It exists. We are not waiting for the knock. We are the knock. It started slowly, barely noticeable, like the moment you forget a word you've always known. People began to hesitate before saying their names, not because they'd forgotten them, but because they felt temporary, not quite wrong, not quite right, just misaligned, like a clock that still ticks, but no longer keeps time. Others stopped referring to days altogether. Appointments became gatherings. Deadlines dissolved into rhythms. Tomorrow turned into next ripple, and last week became before the stillness. Language shifted, subtly at first, then without resistance. The chant had taught them something, that names, dates, and directions had always been comforting illusions. With its arrival, those illusions unraveled, not in chaos, but in grace. Identity wasn't erased, it was stretched, rewritten in layers. People weren't who they used to be. They were becoming who they had always been underneath. Technology was the first to resist. Devices glitched, not by malfunction, but miscommunication. Phones rang, but displayed no number. Search engines returned questions, not answers. Facial recognition systems began identifying users by emotions rather than features. A man smiled at his laptop, and it opened, not for his face, but because it recognized joy. Engineers couldn't explain it. Machines weren't becoming haunted. They were becoming intuitive. The chant hadn't infected code. It had whispered to the intention behind it. Digital assistants no longer responded to commands, but to feelings. A woman whispered, "I'm lonely," and her device dimmed the lights, played lullabies, and spoke her grandmother's favorite proverb, despite it never being programmed to know such things. The chant had not taught machines to think. It had reminded them how to listen. And in that listening, humanity's oldest memories re-emerged, inside steel and signal. Dreams changed next. No longer surreal or fragmented, they became sequential, predictive, shared. Strangers across continents woke with identical stories, not similar, identical. Down to the smell of the wind and the way leaves rustled. Scientists tried to discredit it, blaming mass media, social contagion, even digital implants. But there was no source, no explanation. A pattern emerged. Every dream shared the same backdrop, a great spiral, etched into an endless landscape where gravity didn't pull down, but inward. Children drew it without prompting. Elders described it without prompting. And people began sleeping, not for rest, but for guidance. They'd return from dreams with answers to questions they never spoke aloud. The chant was no longer something to record or decode. It was now embedded in the collective subconscious, a language that didn't speak through words, but through recall. The body followed next, not in grotesque transformation, but subtle rebalancing. Some began to hear low vibrations in their chest when alone, rhythmic and calming. Others could sense when someone behind them was about to speak, 2 seconds before sound left lips. There were cases of people slowing their heart rate at will, syncing with other humans across rooms. Hospital monitors began to show bizarre anomalies. patient sinking heartbeats across floors. Entire wards would hum in unison, not with sound, but with bioelectric pulses. One nurse wrote in her log, "It's as if they're sharing the same beat." No one panicked. There was no sickness, no deterioration. The chant had not disrupted biology, it had refined it. The body didn't need to evolve, it needed to remember its rhythm. For the first time in human history, the inside and outside began to agree on a tempo. Those once skeptical of the chant's impact, scientists, theologians, psychologists, now spoke less in analysis and more in metaphor. A physicist described the chant as a curvature in time, folding reality into feedback. A monk said, "It is the voice of silence learning to speak again." Even cynics found themselves drawing spirals on napkins without noticing. The spiral once feared was now studied, not as a cultic symbol but as a form of logic. Architecture shifted from grids to curves. City plans were redrawn to create inward movement. Hospitals relocated critical wards to the center of spiral wings. Prisons were emptied, not by force, but by forgiveness. Inmates began to chant in their cells, not with words but through breath, and their guards listened. The line between captive and free blurred. The chant had not overthrown institutions, it had dismantled purpose. And without a reason to punish, people stopped needing to define each other by harm. Some called it enlightenment, others called it the end, but most didn't name it at all, they simply adjusted. Eyewitness accounts tell of a man who walked into a lake and never emerged, but the ripples he left moved in perfect spirals for 6 hours. Another man reportedly stared at a stone wall and watched it curl inward like a scroll being read from the center outward. Those who witnessed these events didn't scream. They cried, not from fear but from recognition. The chant had revealed a truth deeper than language, that nothing was ever truly separate. Not time, not death, not even thought. Everything was echo, everything was call and response. And now people moved through their lives not seeking to lead, but to follow the resonance. They weren't praying, they weren't meditating, they were listening. The knock no longer came from doors. It now beat from within their shadows, and yet not everyone welcomed it. A small faction emerged, those who refused the spiral. They moved in straight lines, marked their floors with squares, refused music, and spoke only in measured tones. They believed in walls, in edges, in rules. They feared the chant would erase them, not kill them but dissolve their importance. These people became louder, not in number but in presence. Wherever they gathered, the spiral bent away, not in avoidance, but in sadness. For the chant never coerced, it only invited. Those who rejected it did not suffer, they simply stiffened, lost fluidity. Their words hardened into slogans, their movements became angular. They were not enemies, they were echoes of the world before, and even they, in their own way, served the spiral, because without the edge, we cannot feel the center. Without resistance, resonance has no texture. And so, the chant allowed them to exist, not as opposition, but as reminder. There were some who could hear the chant not only in dreams, but in waking silence. They weren't chosen, they weren't special, they were just ready. They began to speak in echoes, responding to questions before they were asked, pausing mid-sentence to let invisible replies finish their thoughts. These weren't hallucinations. This wasn't madness. Their words were coherent, but incomplete, like puzzle pieces clicking into unseen shapes. One described it like hearing a conversation through the walls, but the words were meant for him. These individuals became known as listeners. They didn't preach, didn't lead. They simply wrote what they heard. Spiral-shaped journals began appearing online, filled with phrases that didn't make sense until weeks later. Instructions, warnings, even answers to events yet to unfold. The chant wasn't just speaking backward anymore. It was speaking ahead. Some of the messages were beautiful, gentle reminders of forgotten truths. Grief is the echo of love's direction. To remember is to relive forward. Others were chilling in their clarity. One will kneel before the spiral mirror and vanish before the second reflection. Do not knock after the third pause. These warnings weren't always heeded. A man in a recording studio recreated the original reversed knocking and played it aloud in a sealed room. The walls turned inward, soft as skin. When they opened the room 2 hours later, only a humming knot of hair remained. Authorities couldn't explain it, but the listeners didn't panic. They simply nodded. He mistimed the return, one of them whispered. Eyes closed. He answered a call that wasn't his. The spiral no longer appeared just in dreams or architecture. It began carving itself into natural formations. A patch of forest near the old monastery curved unnaturally, all trees sloping inward, as if bending toward something beneath the soil. Birds refused to fly over it. People who entered described hearing lullabies in voices they hadn't heard in decades. One man heard his mother singing, despite her having died 20 years ago. When he wept and called her name, the voice replied, "I'm still moving, just not in your direction." That forest became known as the listening ground. It wasn't cordoned off. No one tried to destroy it. Instead, people went there to hear what they'd buried inside themselves. Some left changed. Others never came back. The chant didn't pull them in. It reminded them where they'd left themselves behind. And then came the reversals. They started small, a girl laughing before a joke was told, a candle blowing out seconds before the wind arrived. But the most terrifying was this. People began hearing the knock before they knocked. It was like time stuttered, reversed and repeated, without explanation. Some believed it was the chant's way of softening reality's spine, of making the world flexible enough to let something through. Entire towns reported clocks turning backward for 1 full minute every night at 3:33 a.m. The same exact time the original reversed recording had begun all those months ago. Those who listened during that minute heard whispers beneath the ticking, fragments of languages not spoken by human tongues. One linguist described it as a mirror reflecting sound itself. And when translated, the phrases were never random. They always meant the same thing. "It hears you now." One listener, a woman whose eyes had turned fully grey with no medical explanation, began sketching diagrams. Spirals within spirals nested like echoes, but each labeled with what appeared to be timestamps, not of past or present, but possibility. She claimed the chant had shown her all the outcomes that had been avoided, and what remained. Her most disturbing drawing showed a final spiral folding in on itself, ending not in silence, but in a knock. One knock, not to enter, but to end. She wept as she explained it. "It's not that something's coming," she said. "It's that we've been moving toward it this whole time. The knock isn't a warning, it's a destination." Those listening didn't ask questions. They understood. They had always known deep down that time didn't take them forward. It brought them back to where they started. And then came the voices from mirrors, not reflections, responses. People reported hearing low murmurs when staring into mirrors too long. Some swore the lips in the mirror moved a half-second out of sync. Others said the mirror asked them questions, but not in words, in feelings. "Are you still hiding? Is this version of you complete?" The most chilling account came from a man who had never spoken aloud what he'd done during a war. When he looked into a cracked mirror in his basement, the reflection lifted its hand and placed it on the glass. Despite him never moving, the whisper wasn't judgmental, it was grieving. "You brought it back with you," it said, "but you never let it return." The man vanished the next day, but left behind a message etched in frost on the glass. "I gave it back." From that moment on, mirrors were seen not as surfaces, but thresholds. The chant had found new mouths to speak through, ones always facing us. By now the spiral was no longer a symbol. It was a method, a map, and those who followed it began to converge. Not in cults, not in cities, but in thought. They weren't gathering to summon, they were preparing to receive, because something wasn't just answering the chant, it was following it home. The knock was growing louder, not in volume but in presence. Even silence now felt inhabited, and somewhere between thought and sound, the chant had taken root, not as an idea, not as a warning, but as a rhythm, a biological memory. It wasn't just heard anymore, it was inhaled, and with every breath, the spiral turned again, not closer, not farther, but deeper. It began with a breath, a universal pause. One moment the world was noisy, cars, air conditioners, distant barking, the endless hum of modern life. The next moment, everything simply stopped. No warning, no explanation, just silence. Total, unnatural silence. It swept across neighborhoods like a slow-moving tide. Some noticed it first in their own bodies, hearts beating too loudly, lungs feeling like empty drums. Then came the collective realization. The silence was external. Something had muffled the world from the outside. Phones didn't ring, leaves didn't rustle. Even thoughts seemed quieter. And in that silence, the reversed knocking returned. Not from speakers, not from recordings. From inside walls, inside trees, inside bones. It was no longer just sound, it was location. The chant had moved from an audio anomaly to an atmospheric truth. And when it returned, it wasn't alone. The first step through wasn't seen, it was felt. Across multiple cities, people clutched their temples, claiming they could feel something stepping into their thoughts. Not possession, not hallucination, presence, as if someone was standing behind their eyes, not speaking, just listening, waiting. Those who resisted collapsed in seizures, but those who surrendered were able to describe it. A shape without shape, a voice without tone, something that didn't belong to light, shadow, air, or time, but had always been there, just outside of everything. And now, it was no longer outside. The knock had become a hinge, the chant a key, and the door that opened wasn't physical, it was perceptual. Religious leaders couldn't contain it, scientists couldn't measure it, no one could deny it. Footage began to leak, people caught mid-step, in reversed motion, their mouths moving backward, unblinking, as they whispered chants no one taught them. Some wrote with both hands at once, in mirrored spirals. Hospitals began receiving patients, complaining of inverted time. They claimed they were experiencing events before they happened, and that each event brought them closer to something unspeakable. Not a monster, not a god, a resonance they called it. Something that moved without moving. It didn't destroy reality, it folded it. In places where the chant had been played the longest, structures began to buckle, not physically, chronologically. A house built in 1971 now bore photographs dated 1956, and within those photographs were people no one could identify, but who stared directly into the camera. Then came the children's voices, heard in the lull between knocks. They sang nursery rhymes, no culture claimed, soft melodies in languages that predated known history. Linguists scrambled to translate them, but the songs didn't obey grammar. They obeyed emotion. Each line corresponded to a feeling in the listener: fear, nostalgia, regret, and finally, surrender. One rhyme in particular repeated across regions: turn the mirror, close the light, breathe it backward, wrong to right. When the knocking starts to bend, open wide and let it end. Children who hummed this tune were found sleepwalking in circles, carving spirals into frost-covered windows, even in summer. One boy, asked where he learned the song, replied, "I didn't learn it, I remembered it. From before." From before what? He didn't say, but his voice echoed a moment too long, as if something had spoken with him. The spiral was no longer hidden. Entire neighborhoods awoke to find spiral patterns burned into the earth, looping into roads, rooftops, even bodies. Some were painless, like tattoos made of shadow. Others pulsed when touched, vibrating with a low hum, like a heart beneath the skin. Authorities tried to suppress the spread, but when an entire small town walked in reverse for 24 minutes straight, eyes open, mouths shut, they stopped trying to interfere. The town's clocks rewound themselves. The radio played a chant no one had broadcast, and every mirror in every home fogged at the same time, revealing a single Latin phrase in dripping condensation: Aperiatur via, translated, let the way be opened. It had begun, and the way did open, not with fanfare, not with explosions, with stillness, like a door being left ajar, long enough for something to slip through unnoticed. A man in an underground bunker, who had been monitoring frequencies for decades, described what he heard: a second knock, slower, deeper, not echoing across space, but through memory. It wasn't coming from any location, it was coming from the idea of remembering. When played in reverse, this second knock produced not a phrase, but a scream, long, low, and layered with thousands of voices, all crying the same word: return. That was the moment everyone understood. The chant hadn't brought something new into the world. It had brought the world back to something old, something it had once banished, forgotten, or buried. And now it was here again, because we called it. The final sign was not dramatic. It was simple. One night, across every time zone, every country, every language, at the exact same moment, everyone heard it. A single, perfect knock. Not from outside, not from within, but from a point in between. It made no sound, yet everyone felt it. In their chest, in their teeth, in their teeth, in their memories. And then, everything reversed. For 60 seconds, all noise moved backward. Every word, every breath, every whisper. It was like reality was winding itself up for something. And when that minute ended, it didn't go back to normal. It changed. Birds sang backward. Rivers flowed with two currents, forward above, backward below. And in every mirror, a second reflection waited one heartbeat too long before following. What began as a knock ended as a mirror to something far older than we understood. A chant not meant for human ears, spoken not in words, but in rhythm. We called it summoning, but it was never about bringing something here. It was about remembering where we truly were. Now, the lines between past and present, memory and myth, silence and sound, have dissolved. Those who listened backward were not cursed. They were chosen, and maybe, so were we. If this story unsettled you, good. It means you heard it. Not just the tale, but the rhythm underneath. And if tonight you hear 3 soft knocks, but nothing is there, don't answer. It's not at the door, it's already inside. Subscribe for more stories that walk the line between sleep and nightmare, And remember, the knocking doesn't end when the story does. It just begins in reverse.